Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and can you believe it's been 150 episodes of the Superman Analogue series? And so to celebrate that, the way I did when we got to our first 100 episodes, I'm putting together a compilation of the second set of 50 episodes. So this is episodes 51 through 100. And I am going to go through and provide some commentary between each episode on what I thought was good about them and what I know has changed in the wake, since these are moments in time that I'm talking about these characters. So with that, we open with talking about Carol Danvers, aka Captain Marvel, previously Ms. Marvel. I'll let the episode go. I'll just note before we get started, the weird part is that the way the numbering worked is that Carol Danvers ended our series on Captain's Marvels. So we had covered all the different Captain Marvel characters, and she just happened to be 51, not 50, and so it cut off at the end of the 50 video, and so we're picking up with just to note that we've been discussing Captain Marvels at this point. So with that, here's the video. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and let's wrap up this Captain Marvel series of my Superman Analogue videos. Today we're going to talk about the 5th Marvel Comics Captain Marvel. However, it is one I have mentioned a few times already at this point, because we're talking about Carol Danvers. Carol Danvers has a pretty long history in comics, but only recently took on the name of Captain Marvel. At first, she was a human ally and love interest of Mar-Vell, but eventually she developed powers of her own and went on to be Miss Marvel. Originally, this was through Kree DNA being infused into her, though later this was retconned to her already being a Kree-human hybrid, but with the Kree side dormant. She donned a distaff version of Mar-Vell's costume and went on to have her own adventures. Now, bear with me for an odd theory that is, I will admit, my own. Kree-human hybrids have typically been more powerful than either race solo, kind of like Gohan in Dragon Ball Z. I find this fascinating because Kree canonically aren't supposed to get superpowers. We have been told that both the Kree and Skrull are at their evolutionary limit, though in the case of the Kree, this is because their race was never manipulated by the Celestials, so they have no celestial seed for superpowers the way humans have for mutants, Inhumans, Eternals, or other superhumans, or any of the other species that we've seen that have manifested superpowers. Like the Shi'ar. Even the Skrull are the deviants of their race and so benefit from a celestial manipulation of their species. But the Kree are just the Kree. They have never been manipulated genetically. And of course, while I would say my hypothesis is supported by the majority of evidence, that has been contradicted with various examples like Woe. But Earth-X argued that the Kree lacked the celestial seed that enabled powers, and I typically side with that. Genis and Violet technically are also human hybrids, but they are hybrids by way of Eternals, which are different. They don't have the ability to spontaneously manifest powers, they already just have them. Meanwhile, a good example of supporting evidence is Ultragirl, who is a Kree-human hybrid and has identical powers to Carol Danvers. As Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers was a powerhouse hero, eventually getting her own unique costume that went on to be her iconic look as Miss Marvel. But that heroic career was cut short by a fight with the then villainous Rogue, which I have already discussed. Carol was stripped of her powers and memories by Rogue and went on as a shell of her former self until she joined up with the Starjammers, the proto-Guardians of the Galaxy that was running around in the X-Books. While traveling with them, she had her powers jump-started, transforming her into the cosmically powerful Binary. Binary was in the same class as the Silver Surfer, or possibly even the Phoenix. She was incredibly powerful, and as a super heavy hitter, couldn't really be the focus of a lot of books, because she was just too powerful to really have any sort of physical obstacle. As a result, she only showed up every once in a while. But then Carol Danvers joined the Avengers, and coincidentally, that was just when her powers waned back down to roughly the Miss Marvel levels. During this time, she battled alcoholism while using the name Warbird. Eventually, Carol took her old name back and rose back up to prominence. Then, after the secret invasion train wreck of an event, Phyla-Vell going on to become Quasar, and a Skrull impersonator reminding people just how inspiring Mar-Vell was, the name Captain Marvel was left vacant. After some encouragement from other heroes, Carol took on the name. With her power levels now stable, Carol is determined to be one of the greats of the Marvel Universe. Her new uniform is a palette flip of Mar-Vell's, but with the sash design that she rocked as Miss Marvel. It's a great updated look. And obviously, we're all aware of the character now, because Marvel has pushed her really hard, in part because of the MCU, where Brie Larson is owning the role, portraying the character in various MCU movies, as well as in the What If cartoons. And the MCU version of Captain Marvel has a Carol Danvers that is almost at the power level of her binary form. So I look forward to seeing how they challenge her in future installments. Now, in terms of all the Marvel Captain Marvels, she's power-wise probably the closest to being a proper Superman analog, what with her strength, flight, nigh invulnerability, and limited energy powers. And she's had quite the ride. I mean, from her creation, her name is a nod to Supergirl, what with Kara Zor-El / Linda Danvers, or in more recent stuff, Kara Danvers, sounding quite a bit like Carol Danvers, as is her look, clearly. She's gone from a background player to a headliner, a broken person struggling to reform themselves, to the Celestial Cavalry, to a fucking cop, and back to being a headlining hero. Now she's even launching a new era of Marvel films. If any version of Captain Marvel has been poised to be the company's flagship hero, it's Carol Danvers. Anyway, hope you enjoyed the video. Next time we'll be back with another captain, but until then, stay super, man. So I don't really have a lot that I would say differently about the character of Carol Danvers. I think that I would comment that I actually did really enjoy the Marvels, which is probably the biggest thing that the character has gone through. Besides, I've read some more stuff with her in it, and I've enjoyed it. I really like the Ultimates, for example, but I think that kind of speaks for itself. Like the video, I think, does a really good job there. Moving on to our next set of videos, this next pair is a really interesting pair because I had originally written the Captain Britain post before the Krakoa era, and then I needed to update the Captain Britain post because of the Krakoa era, and it gave me an excuse to talk about Psylocke, aka Captain Britain, aka Betsy Braddock, a character who I've always really loved and I've always wanted to do stuff with. And so this is the Captain Britain Part 1 video talking about Brian Braddock. And with that, here you go. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and I gotta say, it is a relief to be finished with that 5-part series on Captain's Marvels, because my awareness of things related to many of those characters has changed a lot since I initially wrote those threads. Monica made it onto WandaVision, Janice might be coming back, Phyla did come back, and the Carol Danvers movie came out. And since then, she has become a big part of the MCU. So there was a lot of things to update in my discussions of those characters. So why don't we take a break from that while sticking with captains and talk about something a bit simpler. A captain from a multiverse spanning superhero corps of Captains Britain. Oh no. Alright, so for those unaware of the general property of Captain Britain, the character is not a British version of Captain America. If anything, it began more as sort of a mystical version of Daredevil, what with an acrobatic superhero with a mystic staff. And then, and this will become a recurring theme, that all changed about the time Alan Moore joined the book. Originally, the deal was Brian Braddock was presented with a choice between the Sword of Death and the Amulet of Life by the wizard Merlin. He chose life and became a champion for Merlin. But somewhere along the line, he went from being an acrobatic-style character to getting a massive power upgrade, putting him in the Superman class. And that's when roughly Moore came on the book. There was some shuffling of creative teams at the time, and he developed the character into sort of a stiff upper lip of a Superman analog. Now, even crazier, Captain Britain started dealing with extra-dimensional forces, and it didn't take long for him to meet up with alternate reality versions of himself. This is incidentally for the Marvel Comics universe where we first get the designation Earth 616, or for you Cerebro fans, 616. See, it turns out that there are many captains, the name changing depending on what the reality calls Britain. England, Albion, Airstrip 1, etc. And they make up this reality-spanning police force working under Merlin or whomever controls Otherworld. This led to plenty of doppelganger weirdness. He gets replaced by another reality version of himself at one point, he has a weird flirtation with Captain UK, and eventually he becomes the leader of this team of himself. He links up with Excalibur, which basically becomes a continuation of the story started in his book, now with X-Men crossovers. Now, oh boy, I wrote this in January of 2019, and things have changed for the next part of this bit. But when I first wrote it, I said, now, an X-Men connection wasn't weird at this point. His sister was the mutant Psylocke, who was a British mutant whose mind was transplanted into the body of an Asian assassin from Daredevil's foe, the Hand, by Iron Man's enemy, the Mandarin, who had a stint as Captain Britain. And at the time, that was true, and I always thought it was a shame and had ideas like, man, it would be cool to make her Captain Britain. And then bam, the Hickman era of X-Men kicked in, and Betsy Braddock is now back in her original body and Captain Britain leading the team of Excalibur. And I gotta say, that book is amazing. You gotta go read it. It is wonderful, and they have made Betsy from a character I really liked to a character I love so much. But anyway, getting back to Brian for the moment. He's able to fly as well as being super strong and durable thanks to a force field around his body, and he wears a suit that augments that field, making him a true heavy hitter. Speaking of suits, while there have been some duds when looking at Captain Britain's costumes over the years, the Union Jack just makes for some great outfits. And I mean, there have been a lot of variants. The costume keeps getting redesigned, and I mean, a lot. Of course, I should also note there was an Ultimates version, this one a government-funded super soldier wearing a suit that gave him superpowers. And I think there was even a Spider-Man who played double duty. And as with today, there have been multiple stints with characters besides Brian bearing the name, such as with the hero who later went on to be Lionheart. But for the longest time, the title kept coming back to Brian, Merlin's favorite, successor to King Arthur, hero of the multiverse. But that's not where we're at today, because now Betsy is Captain Britain. So for the first time, I'm gonna have to write a thread on Betsy between this video dropping and next week because I have to talk about her. It would be crazy not to. But I should also note what has since happened with Brian. Brian rejected the claim to Captain Britain, having, in a moment of weakness, pulled the sword of death. But since then, in his struggle to be redeemed, through everything, through his alcoholism, through his issues with his wife, through all of his failures of being a superhero, he is struggling to be a Knight of Avalon and has since become Captain Avalon, serving Otherworld in a new capacity. And if you're interested in this character, I would highly recommend you go check out Connor Goldsmith's Cerebro podcast. He did a great episode on Brian Braddock that really made me think about the character in new ways. So I would highly encourage checking that out. Next week, I'm going to be back with an episode on Betsy because, like I said, it'd be crazy not to. But until then, stay super, man. So that was the Brian Braddock video, and I was pretty happy with the updates that occurred for the character. I decided to call the video Captain Britain just because that's how I think of the character, even though he's, I believe, Captain Avalon at the moment. I'm not entirely sure what the status of Brian Braddock is at the moment post Krakoa. I've not been very good at keeping up since Krakoa ended. But that said, it's a character I still really enjoy. And I would highly recommend people check out, for example, the Alan Moore run or the work, anything that Alan Davis was involved with. So the Claremont stuff that was involved as well. Just check out the Captain Britain stuff. It's really fun. And then the character picked up in Excalibur. But with that, we're going to go into one of the more recently written Superman analog threads. It should be no secret that I haven't really written a lot of these recently. Most of these are ones that I wrote at a point in time, and I've tried to update as we get closer to the video. But in this case, this is one that I fully wrote at the height of the Krakoa era in X-Men Comics about Betsy Braddock. So with that, enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and this is a first for my Superman analog video series, because I actually wrote the thread that is serving as the basis for this week's episode today, because it's a character who, when I started the series, wasn't on my radar to talk about necessarily. But then the Dawn of X relaunch of the X-Men line changed the status quo for this character dramatically. So back in January of 2019, when I wrote the thread on Captain Britain, I was talking about Brian Braddock, who fits the bill pretty well. But since then, someone else took on the mantle. His sister, Betsy, formerly Psylocke of the X-Men, but now she is Captain Britain. Now, the Captain Britain core is really complicated, and I talked a lot about it last time, so here's a link to that video, because I'm probably not going to go over that today. And look, I definitely will not be able to go anywhere near as in-depth as Connor Goldsmith does on the Cerebro podcast, so if you like the character, I would recommend you go check out that show. He did a profile on Betsy as the first episode with current Excalibur writer Teenie Howard, and they went into wonderful detail and have way more complicated thoughts than I will ever attempt to convey. So if you want a real deep dive, go check that out. So, Betsy Braddock, twin sister of Brian, was originally introduced in the early days of Captain Britain to be a plot device. She was used as a bystander, a pawn, or a damsel to be saved often. That is to say, when her precognitive powers weren't cluing our hero into some coming danger. At first, these powers weren't directly explained since the franchise was on the periphery of the Marvel Universe. But when Chris Claremont brought her over to the X-Men, her unexplained innate psychic powers were explained to be mutant powers. And this is the point that tied the two franchises together, perhaps inextricably. Now, I will admit that the lens I view the character through is as a kid who got into comics in the 90s. So a lot of information came by me reading up on a character I liked rather than the status quo I was reading at the time. Because Betsy was a very different character in the 90s, and remained that way until now. Yeah, so for more casual X-Men fans wondering how Captain Britain ties into that cool ninja running around from the games and movies, it's complicated. Betsy Braddock has had different powers, skills, hair colors, and even bodies. She has been through a lot. Back in the Captain Britain days, she was reintroduced after Brian's power-up in Otherworld as a model/spy. This is where her iconic purple hair first popped up, a dye job, and her early precognitive powers had evolved into telepathy. She even had a run as Captain Britain for a bit, a detail that I used to dream about bringing back if I ever got to write for Marvel. But now that particular ship has sailed. This was not a particularly good time for the character, too. An evil alternate reality version of her brother tried to rape her, and a duel against the villain Slaymaster left her blind, forcing her to use her telepathy to compensate. But she made it over to the X-Men, where she filled the late 80s spot for a bitchy telepathic head bitch in charge. This is an era that I need to read more of, so apologies for not really having more to say about this time. But if you're wondering how a blind British noble, cloaked and wearing armor, became a ninja, well, that's a good question, because it is weird. So originally it was supposed to be a single storyline where Betsy was transformed by the hand into an Asian woman and brainwashed to be an assassin for the Mandarin. But the artist at the time was Jim Lee, and he drew an amazing design for the character that prompted Claremont to stretch that storyline out a little bit. It was, after all, a weird form of representation that the X-Men was lacking, but in retrospect, it feels like Yellowface. The thing is, this was about the time Claremont was ousted from the X-Books. So whatever plans he had to revert the character to a posh British model/assassin were dropped, and the character would be more or less in this form for the next 30 years. Fabian Nicieza came on to pick up the pieces and decided to retcon the story as a body swap, rather than a mystical plastic surgery job. He introduced an assassin named Kanon, whose body Betsy's mind was now inhabiting, and Betsy's body was inhabited by Kanon's mind. But let's be clear, this was a retcon. Originally, the story had Betsy transformed into this new form, which is why people could recognize her face. Anyway, when Kanon first popped up, she was a bit confused. She had memories as Betsy. Likewise, Betsy had all these martial arts skills that she had never possessed before. Kanon claimed that she must be the original Betsy. It, however, was more complicated. The long and short of it is that the sorceress/interdimensional TV producer, Spiral, was the one who actually did the body swap. And because she just loves the drama, because think of the ratings, she mingled the two minds together in the process. As a result, both share a portion of the other's mind. Later, presumably to simplify things, the powers that be decided to kill off Kanon, leaving Betsy in the wrong body. See, for reasons, this new look for Psylocke was quite popular. And I'm not gonna lie, this is the first instance I can recall being into a comic book character, so I know that I was both the target demo and ultimately part of the problem. Now, 90s X-Men had a number of characters whose bodies had been changed beyond their original forms. Betsy ended up pairing off with Warren Worthington III, formerly Angel but transformed into the blue-skinned murder cyborg Archangel. I thought their bond was actually rather sweet, and the relationship was very nice. While it lasted, that is. And this is about as good a time as any to mention that Betsy had a bit of a rivalry with Sabretooth, going back to her original self. When it was time for their rematch in the 90s, Sabretooth had been going through a bit of a fake-out redemption arc, following his heroic turn in the Age of Apocalypse storyline. When he revealed himself to still be a warped sadist, Betsy confronted him to protect Boom Boom, who had been taking care of him while he was recovering from a fight with Wolverine. When facing off against Betsy, Sabretooth revealed an immunity to psychic attacks thanks to the brain damage caused by Wolverine's claws piercing his skull, and so he was able to ignore Betsy's offensive powers, and so was able to mortally wound her. Warren saved her by tying her to the Crimson Dawn. This left her marked with an eye tattoo and gave her shadow teleporting powers. And this just so happens to be about the time they made the Capcom X-Men fighting game, which would spawn a popular series of Marvel-based fighting games. And Betsy was featured in that game with teleporting powers and a psychic knife, which I can't believe that I haven't mentioned yet, considering it became her iconic power in the 90s. And I can't emphasize enough just how influential those games were to popularizing the character. Seriously, the reach of video game fandom is so much wider than comics. It's how the character became as widely known as she had ever been. And while it's not the first time Betsy had been adapted, she had been on the 90s X-Men cartoon after all, that was only as a supporting character, who was also using the 90s Asian style design. So it's no surprise that this was the version of Betsy that was the basis for Olivia Munn's portrayal in X-Men Apocalypse, without even an attempt to explain the body switching. Actually, there was generally a move to de-emphasize the body switching aspect of the character. Other versions in the comics also shied away from addressing the body swap. Betsy Braddock in Ultimate X-Men was never identified as explicitly Asian, and was presented as British. So maybe she's of mixed race? We met Brian much later, and I don't know if they ever drew a connection between the two. When Claremont came back, her powers changed yet again to telekinesis. Supposedly this was because her telepathy was holding the Shadow King imprisoned, while a fragment of the Phoenix Force empowered her with telekinesis, I think. And this is the time where her signature psychic blade now became a physical weapon by way of her telekinesis. Shortly after, she was taken out of action in the pages of Extreme X-Men with a case of death? I was not checking out the X-books that much in this era, but I was reading Exiles, so I was initially happy to see the 616 version of Betsy show up there, but I had no idea she had recently come back from the dead, nor do I now fully understand how. Also, remember that grudge with Sabretooth? Well, the team was being led by the good Age of Apocalypse version of Sabretooth, which on a meta level addresses the root of how Betsy was even in a position to be wounded by him. She obviously didn't react all that well to first seeing him. Fortunately, the two came to a truce. Eventually, they became somewhat flirtatious co-workers. During this period, the immensely powerful telekinetic Psylocke was the resident flying brick on the Exiles, alongside a version of Gambit that was the son of Namor and Sue Storm for some reason. I'm sorry, I have mentioned that Exiles might be one of my favorite books that Marvel ever put out, but the Chris Claremont run on that series was not one of the better ones. It's still worth checking out just to see how it goes, and there are some very creative ideas and good, deep-cut callbacks, but Claremont had a new roster in mind and shuffled out the existing one a little too quickly for my tastes. Now, considering that Claremont was writing a book about multiverse heroes, you'd think there would have been more appearances by the Captain Britain Corps, but there was a crossover that sort of concluded the initial run of the book called Die by the Sword. When she got back to 616, or 616 for you Cerebro fans, she ended up on X-Force, which had become a Wetworks team by that point, where she had a relationship with Phantom X. And that relationship with Phantom X continued when the Phantom X that she loved became a girl. Then, shortly before the 2019 Dawn of X reboot, the Mystery and Madripoor story arc occurred, where Betsy's original body was reformed, and she and Kanon were able to reclaim their original forms. Entering the Dawn of X, Betsy ceded the Psylocke name to Kanon, and was kind of just crashing on her brother's couch while going through an existential crisis of identity. But then Brian was captured by Morgan Le Fay, and Betsy took up the role of Captain Britain to rescue him. Betsy has the Amulet of Life now, bequeathing the powers of Captain Britain. Mystical energies augmenting her physical form, drawn by the friction of the very multiverse. Plus, she has both her telekinetic and telepathic power sets. She is a knight in mystic armor with a telekinetic sword and shield. And y'all, this is almost exactly the concept I had for a greatest Captain Britain. Betsy with all of her powers. The only thing missing these days is her precognition, and while I wish I could have been the one to write it, Teenie Howard is doing better than I ever could. Betsy assembled a new Excalibur, saved her brother, installing him as Captain Avalon, and saved our world from an invasion through Otherworld by the lost mutants of Arakko. Ultimately, she's the person who brought the current galactic era of mutantdom into fruition. And go read Ten of Swords. I mean, read Excalibur leading up to it too, but Ten of Swords is so good. It's all up on Marvel Unlimited. With Betsy truly owning the role, the Captain Britain Corps has warped to reflect her, and we are left with a Captain Britain who is a champion of the multiverse and link between magic and mutantdom. She represents Otherworld, Krakoa, and Britain, a complicated hero for all. With the Captain Britain powers, she's super strong and nigh invulnerable, and that's further augmented by her massive telekinetic abilities and formidable telepathic ones. Much like Megan, she's not an Omega-level mutant, but her mix of magical and mutant powers makes her pretty close. With her martial arts skills still floating around somewhere in there, she's as skilled in combat as she is powerful. Betsy is left one of the mightiest characters in the Marvel world, and an easy stand-in for Superman on any team. Hell, with the stealthy Psylocke in contrast to the powerful Captain Britain, Betsy and Kanon make for quite the world's finest. Or they would if they weren't extremely uncomfortable being around one another for completely understandable reasons. So that's Elizabeth Betsy Braddock, Captain Britain, formerly Psylocke, absolute queen. Next time, I'm going to be picking up where I left off in the series of Superman Analogue videos with another patriotic captain. But until then, stay super, man. So yeah, that was the Betsy Braddock video. And while there have been updates to the character because Krakoa has ended, they're not substantial ones. So I think that the video still works pretty well. But I just, I love Betsy Braddock, and I love so much that she became Captain Britain. It's a thing that I'd fantasized about for a really long time and like fanficked in my head about. And all of a sudden it's now reality. And that's so cool. Moving on, the next character is a character who I think should need no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. We're talking about Captain America, who I think people understand why this is a Superman analog, even though he's notoriously a very low powered character. But with that, here you go. Hey everyone, I'm Kay Sagan, and after the last couple rounds of Captain's Britain, let's see what this side of the pond has to offer for a Superman analog. Of course, that means I'm talking today about Captain America. And now, Captain America is a big part of the MCU, so I do feel a little weird explaining him, since he's so popular. But he does share a moral vision with the OG Superman, despite having a far more limited power set. So Steve Rogers' Captain America is oftentimes dismissed as having no powers, but as the subject of an experiment to create super soldiers, he is extremely strong, fast, and resilient compared to a normal man. He was, after all, an attempt by the US government during World War II to create a super soldier, someone capable of fighting whole battalions of Nazis by himself. Cap is one of the more persistent Golden Age elements active in the Marvel Universe, and his optimistic, lawful good nature reflects that. When he was reintroduced in the Silver Age, the shift in how heroes were written, the staple of Marvel characters being defined by greater nuance than heroes that had come before, was highlighted with his resolute advocacy for good. This is the same type of display of morality as in the Christopher Reeve Superman movie from 1978, a timeless type of good that almost seems quaint and antiquated in our modern jaded era. Cap's nature as a man out of his time also serves to show off a type of power creep. Not that there weren't really powerful characters from the Golden Age already. Cap's ability to still be not just relevant, but a major player is a testament to how justified his place in the MCU is. You see, heroes and villains had increased their average power level just as the stresses on society had become more complex. Captain America was the cutting edge of yesteryear. His disadvantaged starting place is evident that a moral path is hard, but ultimately a greater victory. This might be a bit of a spoiler for Endgame, but Cap is pretty well known for staring down certain doom and not blinking. Now, for a character who represents classic virtue in the face of modern society, sometimes society bites back. He's been stripped of his rank and title several times, but he never stopped fighting for what's right. My personal favorite identity he took up when these types of things happened was the Captain, wearing an updated version of his base Captain America suit, but with darker tones. Nowadays, you might recognize that from the costume that US Agent wears. But then there's also the much more head-scratching Nomad costume, which has the one saving grace of really making Cap look like a Superman type, what with the cape and all. And Cap was as prone to the trends as any hero, such as the 90s period, where he lost the super soldier serum from his blood and had to wear an armor made for him by Iron Man. He's also had smaller changes, like losing his shield, then donning the original triangular one, various facsimiles, or energy shields. But he always comes back to his iconic shield, which is an alloy of vibranium and adamantium, making it the one thing that Wolverine can't cut. And while his greater fame is a newer development thanks to the MCU movies, he's always been a flagship, no pun intended, character for Marvel Comics, and thus has been adapted several times. First for a series of TV movies that happened about the same time as the Bixby Ferrigno Hulk show, and I will say that the changes made to translate the character to screen in that didn't work. But then I maintain that the 1990 movie had a lot of potential because of some of the surprising for the time faithfulness to the books. The biggest problem was that Captain America isn't really the hero of the story of that movie, but rather a sidekick to the President of the United States of America. He of course had an Ultimates version, which did a pretty good job of updating the costume. However, for the character, I like the added military vibe. It works with the idea of him being your dad back home from the war, or maybe cool older brother or knight in shining armor, either way, back from the war. By Volume 2, they basically had the version that would be used in the first MCU movie. The only thing was that this Cap was a smidge more jingoistic. Still a good guy, but he represented America's flaws more overtly, and this of course was being written in the early 2000s, the big war on terror era. And yes, of course, I'm going to show the France panel. But where Cap really stepped up his presence was with the MCU. It helps that Chris Evans is so damn charming and perfect for the role. Captain America, the First Avenger, is a shockingly good adaptation of a difficult character. However, it is sometimes overlooked amidst Phase 1. And yep, I'm going to shamelessly plug 2 of my podcasts where I talked about Captain America, the First Avenger, both on Another Pass and on Men of Steel. However, it was with the Winter Soldier that the property became a frontrunner among the MCU. Here we see a fantastic version of the suit he wore when he became Director of S.H.I.E.L.D. for a time, on screen, and a perfect illustration of the role of Captain America in a modern setting. The follow-up movie, Civil War, was practically the Avengers movie for the launch of Phase 3, showing what the stakes were and really closing out the solidarity that Phase 2 represented. It's a really good movie and very important to the MCU. However, it lacked the Winter Soldier's elegant quest for Cap to find his place in the world and to know who he could really trust. And I mean, it would be rude of me not to mention that I also talked about Captain America: The Civil War on Another Pass. Now here's the big reason why Captain America makes sense to be part of this series. I've noticed at Comic-Cons and on Halloweens that kids don't default to Superman anymore. They go as Captain America. He's the pure hero that we need to encourage kids to aspire to. It's not about hate or vengeance, it's about hope. In the comics, Captain America is still at the forefront of the heroes of this era. He's made friends with people living on Krakoa, saved his world from being rewritten by Mephisto, and continues to be a champion. However, we have seen the MCU version of Steve Rogers' Captain America ride off into the sunset. But that's because human actors age, and Captain America is timeless. He's a hero that we could really use in the real world. Anyway, next time, I'll be back to talk about a different type of super soldier. But until then, stay super, man. So I put some thought into the order of what Superman analogs come out, but there is certainly a degree of jazz that goes into it. I have a lot of fun just riffing on, okay, well, that was yesterday's theme. This is the next theme, especially when I was doing these daily as written threads. So Captain America, I think, works as a Superman analog, but it obviously set up the next one. And the next one then gives me a good segue into talking about its own theme, which is getting into Golden Age themed characters. Captain America really starts that whole conversation, frankly. And so the next one we're going to talk about is the amalgam of Captain America and Superman himself. And I think that's a distinct character that is worth discussing. So let's talk about Super Soldier next. So last time I made the argument that Captain America was a Superman analog by virtue of his character, even if he has his power level turned down a smidge from the Man of Steel. But what if we close that gap? What if there was once a Dragon Ball Z style fusion dance between Captain America and Superman? Well, ladies, gentlemen, and others, I give you Clark Kent, Super Soldier. In the 90s, Marvel and DC had a crossover where the characters of each line were pitted against each other with fans voting to decide the outcome of the top tier matches. This was most noteworthy to me for two things. One, it's how I first discovered Captain Marvel, the wielder of the power of Shazam. And two, it was the excuse for the Amalgam event. See, the big fights didn't really matter because it was a popularity contest. Heroes that had more cachet won, even if their power class was way below the one that should have won, such as was the case with Wolverine and Lobo. And even ones that were a little bit more even, like Wonder Woman vs. Storm, still felt like it was handled a bit conveniently. Amalgam was a fun exercise where characters from each line were merged together into one composite character. Sometimes this was between similar characters, like the Challengers of the Unknown and the Fantastic Four, coming together to become the Challengers of the Fantastic, who had a roster made up of the Fantastic Four, but a gimmick more like the Challengers of the Unknown, but both were exploratory teams created by Jack Kirby, so it fit. And sometimes it was strange pairings, like Howard the Duck and Lobo the Mad Zarnian, creating Lobo the Duck, which, when you think about the tongue-in-cheek meta-commentary about comics, it makes sense, but in terms of their physicality and shtick, it seems quite odd. Super Soldier was the former. He was a fusion of Captain America and Superman. Now, I personally think they should have used Wonder Woman, but that's a different rant. Anyway, Clark Kent was a 4F soldier injected with a serum derived from the blood of a dead alien during World War II, giving him all of the alien's powers once activated through a bombardment of vital solar radiation. The Amalgam Comics line presented a world where the comics existed for the whole of their shared history, so Super Soldier was a legitimate Golden Age hero among the various patriotic heroes of the day. Eventually, like Captain America, he was frozen in ice but revived in the modern era. Now, this Clark Kent had been a war correspondent in World War II, and he resumed his reporter career when thawed, aided by an older Jimmy Olsen. He battled such foes as Green Skull, a Lex Luthor that had been scarred by kryptonite poisoning. As far as I know, he appeared in only about 5 or 6 books, 2 one-shots, 2 issues of the initial Marvel and DC crossover, and minor roles in JLX and possibly another team book. The character leans more on the Captain America side of the pairing for his backstory, but the two fit so well together that it hardly matters. It's fun to imagine a Superman that has all the training of Captain America, a really effective Sentinel of Liberty and champion of the oppressed. I loved the Amalgam books. They were fun and very appreciative of the deep lore of comics. And last time I looked, the collections were pretty easy to find, so check them out if you can. Next time we'll be talking about a true Golden Age Superman analog, a real man of the hour. And of course, until next time, stay super, man. So one thing about characters that have very limited appearances is that the video, generally speaking, will sort of hold up as a result. And I think that the Super Soldier video holds up pretty well. Just because he only has the couple of appearances because of Amalgam being such a limited experience. But it was a great segue, especially because the second issue is deliberately set during the Golden Age of Comics and is riffing on a bunch of characters from the Golden Age of Comics. This is a good segue into just discussing some Golden Age superheroes. And so I open with a character who I play up his power level a little in the video. He's not quite that powerful in most appearances, but he's just kind of generally tough and strong. But I talk about Hourman. So let's get into that video. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and I want to stick with Golden Age characters this week. Many of these characters back in the day were heavily influenced by Superman, and didn't deviate as dramatically as later heroes would. So let's talk about one that had a really interesting shtick, Hourman. Hourman began as a character for DC Comics in the 1940s, and as far as I know, there have been 3 major characters to bear that name, although I'm sure there's room for plenty more over the years. I'm going to focus on the first one right now. I'll come back around to the second one at some point, and I'll do the third when I inevitably discuss DC 1 million. The first Hourman was a man named Rex Tyler, who developed a drug called Miraclo, which gave him superpowers on par with the Golden Age Superman for 1 hour per day. And by that I mean faster than a speeding bullet, able to leap a tall building in a single bound, invulnerable, more powerful than a locomotive, etc. You know, the basics. Hourman is an iconic member of the DC Golden Age roster, lacking any immediate Silver Age counterpart, an easy-to-explain gimmick, and a distinct look with his dramatic hooded outfit and mustard color scheme. Because his powers are drug-related, the character usually is set aside when comics have tried to play down substance use. The 60s saw him getting less coverage, and his successors stepped out of the limelight during the 80s war on drugs. However, because he's so iconic, he makes for a great inclusion in period pieces, such as the excellent Sandman Mystery Theater, where he was labeled the Man of the Hour. He was also prominently featured in James Robinson's amazing The Golden Age. Modern stories often deal with a drug he uses becoming addictive or having side effects. Narratively, the use of a drug that gives him short-term powers is great because you can have big action scenes, but keep the threat and narrative stakes high. Hourman Mark I is a great, funky example of Golden Age heroes. He'd make for an awesome low-budget superhero movie. DC. And I should note that since I wrote the original thread, Hourman has appeared on the CW Stargirl series. And while he definitely fits the role of a Superman analog, at least in 1 hour spurts, he's not alone from his era. So next time, we'll be continuing with Golden Age superheroes. But it's probably not one you normally would think of in this context. So with a character like Hourman, who is dead currently, as far as I know in comics, I think he's still dead from the 0 Hour event. I'd have to completely double check that one, but I don't think he's reappeared. I think his son has reappeared. So again, this is a character who I believe my take on it is still pretty up to date. And it's still a fun character that I'm really glad to discuss. Next up is a more of a moment in time for a character. It's just a brief period for the character of Dr. Fate when his power set was modified to be more like a Superman type character that I just enjoy as a footnote in the character's history. I don't really do Magic comics that much, but I do enjoy some excursions into the more mystical kind of books. And so I have enjoyed some Dr. Fate stuff, and it's fun to talk about the character in the context of this series, which is, of course, a very brief run. But here's the video. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and now I have mentioned that a lot of Golden Age characters were inspired by Superman, what with him creating the genre and all. And sometimes this even happened to characters who weren't originally intended to be a Superman analog, as was the case with Dr. Fate. Dr. Fate began as a master of the mystic arts, later to be understood as an avatar for an ancient Lord of Order. Generally, his threats were more abstract and his powers less physical. He was, and remains, DC's classic magic guy. However, there was a stretch where he was powered down from sorcerer to magically powered Superman. This was the era where he rocked a weird half-helmet version of his normal look and went off on more traditional superhero adventures. In a way, this incarnation of Kent Nelson was kind of like what DC would do to Captain Marvel / Shazam, a magical flying brick, rather than the sci-fi premise of Clark Kent. Now, due to how weird a take on this character was, it's often referenced in stories set in the Golden Age, but that's about it. The classic version of Dr. Fate as a powerful mystical agent of order is by far the more popular version for any kind of new story about the character. And honestly, that's because DC has plenty of guys who can leap an eighth of a mile and hoist a car into the air. The niche they really need to fill is a mystical avatar of an ancient power, and that's how they use the character to this day. But just as a trivia note, it is fun to think of a time where Dr. Fate could stand in for Superman. Anyway, next time we'll be dipping our toes back in the well of patriotic Golden Age Supermen, and this is one that actually doubled down on that concept a bit more than even Captain America. But until then, stay super, man. So yeah, that was a quick footnote in Dr. Fate's history. Next up, we are getting into a bunch of characters that I know mostly from the Terra Obscura series of books that spun off from Tom Strong. And then I did some more research about them. These were characters that Alan Moore reintroduced in that, but then was picked up by Paul Hogan for the book series. And then also Dynamite Comics has done a bunch of stuff with them that I haven't read, and I keep noting that, which is because it was just, they're public domain characters, and as a result they're able to be used for a bunch of stuff. And so let's get into the first of these characters, and this is kind of a weird one, but was the most patriotic and thus, you know, felt the most like we were talking about the Super Soldier again, which has its own kind of vibe. And so that is talking about the Fighting Yank. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and oh boy, I was not kidding when I said that there were a lot of Superman analogs back in the golden age of comics. Now, I was introduced to several of these characters back when Alan Moore's brainchild of an imprint, America's Best Comics, which at this point was owned by DC Comics, did the series Terra Obscura, which revived several from Nidor Comics, including The Fighting Yank. And yes, I had to check the name of the company that created the character initially. Fighting Yank was a modern-day guy named Bruce Carter, who was empowered by the spirit of his ancestor, a veteran of the Revolutionary War, kind of making him an ancestor worship version of Captain Marvel / Shazam. He had the usual set of super strength, flight, and invulnerability. You know the drill. He's also similar to that amalgam super soldier type character in that he has a distinct fused style of Captain America and Superman. He's not the only one either. Since the 40s, there have been several revivals. The one I'm most familiar with is the aforementioned America's Best Comics version, where his daughter took up the mantle. This series, Terra Obscura, was very fun and dealt with a world being reintroduced to superheroes. The daughter, Carol, developed a lesbian relationship with Miss Mask, a street-level superhero, forming their own world's finest team, which at the time was relatively groundbreaking to be coming from a major publisher. I recall the story being tastefully sweet. But like I mentioned, the character has been revived more than once, and the other big one would be by Dynamite Comics in their Project Superpowers series. Now, even as of recording this video, I still haven't read it, so I can't really comment on anything from that line. Sorry. Aside from the costume being a little too simple, I dig the idea of an ancestor worship type character, a time-honored tradition in our mythology. I enjoyed the Terra Obscura version, though that book was crawling with Superman, so every character needed a thing to stand out. Comics are modern mythology, after all. Both versions benefit from updated designs and a more introspective look on the American dream. Either way, it's a fun character that began as an incredibly on-the-nose take on the patriotic Superman, and I think that's fun. Anyway, next time we'll be continuing with the Nidor line and talking about a very patriotic Superman-type character from the golden age of comics. But until then, stay super, man. So I'm not going to have that much to say about each of these videos because most of it's coming from me just really enjoying the Terra Obscura miniseries. There were two of them that ran, and I liked both of them. So the next character is very much a Superman analog, but I really enjoyed in the Terra Obscura series how he was played as a drunk. And dealing with substance issues with a character that powerful, I thought was a really interesting balance to sort of deal with. And so it was a fun character to explore because substance abuse issues are a thing that I have to think about a lot in the industry I've been working in for the last decade because I work in wine and spirits. So that's just a thing that I enjoy about this character and the conversation about him. So yeah, with that, let's talk about the American Crusader. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and we've been doing these videos for a little over a year now, and you might be asking, who's left? Well, plenty. The Nidor line alone had a ton of thinly veiled Superman analogs. So let's do another aggressively patriotic Ubermensch, the American Crusader. As with the Fighting Yank, I mostly know the character through the revival by DC's imprint, America's Best Comics. In that series, everyone could stand in for Superman, but American Crusader stood out as the real powerhouse of the group. In that series, the character was held in check by an alcohol addiction. As a result, he was unreliable and thus sidelined for most of the series. The character was a classic caught in an explosion type, gaining vast strength, invulnerability, and some kind of energy power. He referenced destroying something from orbit, but I have no idea if it was I-beams or something else. Meanwhile, he kept a secret identity as a nebbish college professor named Archie Masters. As with the rest of the Nidor line, he had a revival in the Project Superpowers run, which I still have not read, but sports a cool design by Alex Ross. American Crusader is another example that is very close to a real version of Super Soldier. During the war times, patriotism was big, sure, but the idea that people granted great power would use it responsibly was a true comfort to the readers. As a result, it's no surprise that readers were hungry for this type of character in such turbulent times. So next time, I'll be talking about another star-spangled Superman. But until then, stay super, man. So yeah, that was the American Crusader. And like I said, most of my experience with him is from the Terra Obscura books. Likewise with the next character, who I was really intrigued by because he's really similar to the one that follows. So next up is the Liberator, who is just this like vaguely patriotic because he's from the 40s type superhero who is otherwise just another guy who has a serum that gives him powers and abilities far beyond the mortal man. So yeah, here's the Liberator. Hey everyone. I'm Case Aiken, and we are going to stick with the Nidor line this week, because damn, they had a lot of Superman analogs. So yes, we have another superpowered patriot today, the Liberator. The Liberator shares a lot in common with our next entry, but suffice it to say, Nelson Drew was a chemistry teacher who deciphers an ancient Egyptian formula to devise a serum that gives him superpowers, though in this case he has to keep drinking it regularly. This was still the early days when it wasn't super clear, no pun intended, if Superman could fly or not, so the Liberator's power set of super strength, 9 vulnerability, and super speed certainly feel right at home next to most of our examples. He was also extremely patriotic because of reasons. So yet another candidate for amalgam super soldier, but real, this time even sharing the serum part. As with the rest of the Nidor characters, I know him through DC's imprint America's Best Comics series, Terra Obscura, which was, again, a really fun book. Generally in that, he was cast as a solid hero, but not quite in the same power class as the American Crusader, nor the genius of guys like Black Terror or next week's entry. And again, he was used in Dynamite's Project Superpowers, which I still haven't read. For what it's worth, I like the Liberator. His gimmick means that he has stakes in a fight, like Hourman, but less severe, and his power set, more than many, is truly a list of super versions of normal human abilities. The power fantasy feels attainable, which is a strong metaphor. As far as costumes go, well, this was World War II. Most characters had some kind of patriotic thing going on for them. The Liberator wore a star-spangled t-shirt and short shorts, and in all adaptations since then, they've changed that to pants. Thankfully. Next time, we'll be talking about another serum-powered Superman, but this is one that doesn't feel the need to put on any kind of outfit to do his work. Rather, he's a man of science wearing clothes to wear out in the field. So next time, we'll be talking about Doc Strange. No, not that Doc Strange. But until then, stay super, man. Man, one thing I really love about the Liberator is that in addition, like he probably can jump really far because he's super strong, but like his big mode of transportation is his super speed. And I really dig that. I think that that is an underutilized element of Superman. And the fact that he can fly now is, sort of takes away from that sort of awesome part of his power set. So it's nice to have a character who really emphasizes that. And I just really dig that part about the Liberator, that he's like very much a speedster who happens to be Superman level strength and durable, or not quite Superman, he's like Golden Age Superman level strength and durable. And that brings us to our next character, who is very much a Superman level from the Golden Age specifically type action adventurer. And I freaking love Dr. Hugo Strange. I have looked at some of his old stories, and they are very much like a fusion of Superman and Doc Savage, and that is exactly what I am here for in terms of Superman Man of Science. So this is a character that I really was happy to have discovered by way of Alan Moore's Tom Strong run, where Tom Strange shows up as a character. And so yeah, this is Tom Strange. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and at first glance, today's Superman analog is going to look more like a Doc Savage homage, which is a discussion for a later day. But for the last Nidor superhero that I want to talk about right now, Doc Strange easily can fit into Superman's shoes. Doc Strange, not to be confused with Doctor Strange, was something of the flagship character of the Nidor line. Like the Liberator, he derived his powers from a serum he concocted, in his case giving him basically the Golden Age Superman's powers, exactly. Opting for a plainclothes style, a choice that I can appreciate. He fought villains with his vast powers and scientific genius. I mean, Doc Savage comparisons aren't unwarranted. It seems that the character was pretty popular back in the day, and was used to reintroduce the whole line in the aforementioned DC imprint, America's Best Comics. This was through a storyline in Alan Moore's Tom Strong book. To the best of my understanding, Moore had started working on the concept for Tom Strong when it was pointed out the similarities to the previous Tom Strange, and decided to fold that into a larger concept of parallel Earths quantumly entangled. But that said, as far as his actual Golden Age stories, I don't have a lot to say about Dr. Thomas Hugo Strange and his Absalon-fueled adventures. I can say, though, that his popularity is why I knew anything about the characters I discussed over the last few weeks. He's just a very pure, two-fisted brawler, the very roots of the Superman archetype ramped up to 11, but stripped of some of the artifice that would be affixed through direct emulation of Superman. I always love a Superman man of science, and this was that. So despite his similar power set and characterization, I actually think that Doc Strange pulls off being a rather unique take on the archetype. Meanwhile, next week's will be a bit more of a flagrant copy. But until then, stay super, man. Yeah, Doc Strange is such a fun character, and the naming, the fact that that gets repeated by Marvel with the character that is now much better known is, sort of frustrating from a trying to research the character standpoint. But yeah, such a fun character. I really dig this fusion of the superhero with the adventure archetype. I really love me some good old-fashioned Pulp Fiction stories, and so this is exactly that kind of vibe, but with the Superman type of archetype that I clearly really enjoy as a reader. Next up is the most blatant ripoff of a Superman character. I shouldn't even really say that. He has actually quite a few differences, but he just happens to be the first. This is the first Superman analog. This is the first one to be created in the wake of Superman and inspired by Superman with his exact power set. Now, those powers are where he was when he first appeared, so it's faster than the speeding bullet, more powerful than a locomotive. But with that, let's talk about Wonder Man. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and alright, let's just get into this one, because this is a no-holds-barred knockoff of a Superman analog. One that, as far as I know, is the first. I give you the Golden Age Wonder Man. Now, this guy got on my radar because he infamously was immediately the subject of a lawsuit from DC Comics, and as a result, only had one appearance. There's even a Wikipedia article about the court case linked down below. Besides the legal situation, the other thing that makes him stand out is that he shockingly was created by Will Eisner, best known for The Spirit, a legend in the field who one of the biggest awards in comics is named after. Given that, it's not surprising that it actually looks pretty good. In the comic, Fred Carson has a shadow-style journey to the east, where he's gifted with a ring that gives him superpowers. I mean, we're told about that at the very top. The actual story involves Wonder Man traveling to deal with war criminals. The adventure itself is dynamic and well drawn, all things considered. I mean, this is very early Golden Age, when the medium was barely defined. Hell, Superman was barely defined. This was the first year of the Man of Steel's existence. And a lot of the similarities would be ignored these days, frankly. But at the time, it was too close. The book had one issue and ended with a special offer never to be fulfilled. I'll note that the book featured a portable TV concept akin to what eventually became reality, and ultimately cell phones, as well as a refugee subplot. All in all, very prescient. Sad to think about what could have been. Now, Wonder Man is a pretty good adjective name. Almost works as well as Superman, as a thing we would call a person in real life. At least we got Robin the Boy Wonder, Marvel's Wonder Man, and nope, I think that's about it. Fortunately for those interested, the issue can be found in the public domain, so I have a link down below. But dang, Wonder is a really good adjective. I really think that there probably should be at least some major character to use it in their name, but I just can't think of one right now. Well, until I do, stay super, man. I recently heard a story that the reason that the Marvel Comics Wonder Man was created was that the editors between DC and Marvel were arguing and said that the Avengers couldn't beat Superman by himself. And so they wrote a story where they basically fought a Superman character. And I don't know if that's true. It could very well be apocryphal. But thinking about it, it makes me wonder if that, like, Wonder Man is a very generic name, but it would be really fascinating if it is a deliberate nod to this character, or if the Silver Age Wonder Man is actually an update of the Golden Age Wonder Man. And it might be a bit of trivia that's too obscure, like the way that, like, we all know this now because of the way the internet works, but back in the 60s, I don't know how much everyone knew about like the failed first attempt at doing a Superman ripoff of a character. But anyway, on that note, I teased the next one, and this is another one of the ones I consider a true fork of the Superman archetype, because we're going to talk about Wonder Woman, which is taking Superman and doing a distaff counterpart and then doing enough of her own thing and being early enough in the timeline that it really allowed for a lot of characters based on her to exist as well. And so I see characters, and this is also true of Captain America, by the way, that there are clearly characters who are these big pillars of morality, and have a specific kind of vibe that is distinctly different from Superman, but the root character that caused the forking to occur is definitely a Superman archetype. And so Wonder Woman is definitely that. So let's talk about her. Hey everyone, I'm Kay Sagan, and for this week's video, I want to talk about a character who took a similar foundation to the Man of Steel and really defined their own archetype, while still effectively being a Superman analog. So let's talk about Wonder Woman. Like Superman himself and Captain Marvel and many of these other characters we've discussed, she first appeared in the Golden Age, and has since gone on to have a continued presence in comics to this day. As a result of this continued publishing history, she has diverged from the baseline Superman archetype dramatically. I would argue that she has forked the concept. See, when she was created by William Moulton Marston in the 40s, she was explicitly created to be a power fantasy for women. The idea was to be a female character as strong as Superman or any of these other heroes that were popping up at the time, but explicitly feminine as well. As I've noted before, during the Golden Age, the Superman idea wasn't as well defined as it would come to be, so this parallel only covered a small number of things that we now associate with Superman. Wonder Woman had a mythological backstory as a member of the Amazons, which gave her a martial bent. Rather than a lone survivor, she was a chosen representative. All of this to say that from the same initial power fantasy concept, she was defined very differently for the audience. But it is the same initial fantasy. While she's only become resistant to bullets in later years because of power creep, they were never an impediment, due to the conceit of her being able to deflect them with her bracers by moving at super speed. And while she can properly fly now, she's always been able to move freely through the air due to her invisible jet. She also used to be able to glide on the currents of winds, which I always thought was a very cool variant of true flight. Clearly, she can fill the role of Superman in the stories. Even in The Nail, which was a story predicated on Superman is so important that everything goes to shit without him, Wonder Woman was clearly the person everyone looked to be that beacon of hope. And hey look, shameless plug, we recently talked about that story on my podcast, Men of Steel. Now, because of her importance to the DC universe, she consistently appears in material in other mediums, such as animation, or very famously in the live-action TV show with Linda Carter, although less famously, the failed pilot with Kathy Lee Crosby, or infamously, the failed pilot with Adrian Palicki. And hey, we talked about all of these on Men of Steel when we did a whole bunch of episodes about Wonder Woman, which we did in the lead-up to Wonder Woman 1984. When she was finally brought to the big screen, it was a huge hit. Gal Gadot has done a fantastic job with the role, even if every outing has not been up to the same level of quality. She remains a bright spot in a somewhat troubled cinematic universe. And Wonder Woman has also had plenty of characters based on her, just like Captain Marvel, just like Captain America, just like Superman. And some still bear a close enough of a resemblance to be considered Superman analogs themselves, while others have diverged too far really to be considered for this series. It's a safe bet that there will be a Wonder Woman-based character if someone is doing anything Justice League inspired, such as the High's companion, Right, from the Change or Die Stormwatch arc that I discussed before, or Amaze from Apollo and Midnighter's original team before joining the Authority. Wonder Woman has evil counterparts, such as Superwoman, an evil alternate reality version of her that in some continuities is an exiled Amazon, a Kryptonian, or in some even a member of the Marvel family. And yes, I will be talking about all of these characters at some point. Wonder Woman has also had various sidekicks, who also fit the bill, so there are plenty of Wonder Woman-inspired characters that I will be discussing on this series. As a being molded from clay and given life as a baby by the Greek gods, she might be a more specific concept than Superman, but the fantasy is no less inviting. All of this to say that sometimes a job for Superman is really meant to be a job for Wonder Woman. Now, while today I talked about a character who has a bit of a martial bent, next time I'll be talking about some Golden Age sidekick characters who do actually have military ranks, even if they're a bit more comical in nature. But until then, stay super, man. I think the funniest thing is that I was very praising of Gal Gadot in this video, which for anyone who is like wondering where my politics are, I'm not particularly a fan of her politics, we shall say. But yeah, that was a silly one. This is a scenario right here where these two episodes drop that I believe I initially did them in reverse order when I wrote them, but I'm keeping them in the video order, which is to say that Wonder Woman, I think I had to hold off on releasing that thread. And so I did a quick thread about the next topic. And that topic is, of course, the Lieutenants Marvel, which are really fun characters from the Silver Age and Golden Age. Really Golden Age, I should say. They're like Captain Marvel doesn't really have a Silver Age per se. He's got a bit of a Bronze Age that is a throwback to his Golden Age stuff because of the way that his cancellation and then being revived in the 70s and 80s occurred. So Captain Marvel, I think, is a character who was denied his Silver Age, but he had a really robust Golden Age, and the Lieutenants Marvel are part of that. So let's talk about them. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And for this week's Superman Analogue, I want to talk about some more lighthearted characters. So let's talk about the Lieutenants Marvel. The Lieutenants Marvel were three guys who all just happened to be named Billy Batson, just like the OG Captain Marvel. The three sought out our Billy due to him being a public figure sharing their name, and befriended him. Later on an adventure, our Billy was captured, and they commented, "Oh no, he can't say Shazam." And lo and behold, it worked for them. Lightning struck, and they all transformed. Seriously, that's it. That's why they have effectively the same powers as Superman. The logic's insane. But for them, it worked. We got three lower-ranked versions of the main character without deviating in dramatic ways. Rather, they reinforced their idea that anyone could be a member of this fantasy. It feels very accessible on a metaphorical level. This is the Superman archetype, but framed as a subordinate instead of the lead. And this is kind of rare in comics. Usually characters like this who are so powerful end up either being the lead or being held in reserve, like Mon-El when he first joined the Legion, or the Superman Emergency Squad. But in this case, they're more supporting casts that happen to be really strong. Anyway, these guys had nicknames: Fat Billy, Tall Billy, and Hillbilly. Yuck, yuck. They've had minor modern appearances, but for the most part have been usurped by the extended Shazamily. But I would argue this shows how advanced the original Captain Marvel was. The book was brimming with ideas that would later become mainstream in decades post. It's nice to think about how anyone could be a Lieutenant Marvel, even if they weren't destined to necessarily be the Captain himself. Next time, I'll be talking about a Golden Age character who came to fill the role of Superman retroactively. But until then, stay super, man. Man, that is a fun set of characters. I really agree. This is, again, a scenario where like the characters haven't really been updated, so there's not a lot for me to say beyond what their sort of root history is. Like I said, I think that this Shazamily is the modern interpretation of these characters, so that works just fine. There's been whole bunches of Shazam runs since I did this video, but I think that the core character keeps sort of finding its way back to homeostasis, which is no currently being published book and being available with a generally good kind of vibe for the Captain specifically, and to a lesser extent Mary and Freddy, but the rest of the extended group of Shazam characters are usually just sort of like not active. And so there's no modern version of the Lieutenants Marvel that I believe are currently functioning in the comics. The Shazamily could come back anytime, so I don't want to say that for sure. But we move on to a character who is always an active character because people love the Alan Scott Green Lantern. I love the Alan Scott Green Lantern. Kyle Rayner is probably my Green Lantern because of where I got into comics in the 90s, but Alan Scott has always been one that I've really, really cared about, and he's probably my number two. maybe my number one, and he's the one I think about more. And when I used to fantasize about being a Green Lantern, I used to fantasize about having Alan Scott's powers specifically. So he's a really cool character. And this is a great segue into a bunch of interesting ones that we're going to talk about because it is going to definitely reference the Golden Age, the comic series, the Golden Age, which is a really fun thing. So let's look at the Alan Scott video. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and today I want to talk about a Superman analog that got the role more or less retroactively. You see, when DC Comics merged the continuities of their multiverse in the 80s into one timeline, changes had to be made for characters who had continuous publishing histories. This all happened around the events of Crisis on Infinite Earths. For characters from the Silver Age of comics, this was generally accomplished by the sliding timescale, moving events initially set in the 60s into the modern era, with some exceptions, such as Wonder Woman being replaced by Black Canary in the founding of the JLA, since she was being introduced as a new character, as opposed to someone with a few years of backstory. Meanwhile, for characters set in the Golden Age, which was inherently tied to World War II, bigger changes had to occur, such as Dr. Midnight taking the role of Batman in some stories, while the Sandman and Sandy took his role in ones that required a sidekick. Now, for Superman, one of the characters that filled that role was the Golden Age Green Lantern, Alan Scott. Unlike the later space cop concept that defined the Silver Age Green Lantern, the Golden Age version was a free agent with a magic ring. While his powers are pretty different from Superman's, he is still a powerhouse in his own right. So while on his own, Alan Scott wouldn't be what I would call a Superman analog, he was used in place of the Man of Steel in story retellings. It helps that he is a cape-wearing, upstanding citizen who is canonically very tall and imposing. Alan Scott was an engineer in the 40s. He came across his Green Lantern because it just happened to be a Green Lantern, literally a lantern used to signal safe passage on trains. When there was an accident, he was spared because he happened to be holding the lantern at the time. This is because, unbeknownst to him, the lantern had been forged from metal from a fallen meteorite, a magic meteorite. Alan went on to don an intentionally garish outfit and switch careers from trains to radio. In the 80s and 90s, he was presented as the big gun of the Golden Age superset. This was in flashback stories in Batman, the Golden Age miniseries, and many other appearances of the JSA in the World War II era. During this period, if you were talking about the big guy during the Golden Age, you were talking about Alan Scott. For the record, his powers are similar to the Silver Age Green Lantern. So if you happen to see the Ryan Reynolds movie or saw Justice League Unlimited, you have a basic idea of the types of powers he has. Now, these weren't quite as well defined and kind of changed from issue to issue. Also, ultimately, they settled on a weakness that was wood, rather than things that happened to be yellow. He initially had a different oath, too. Now, from a textual standpoint, the fantasy is similar to Superman, in that it is a person bequeathed with great powers. However, in this case, the powers are not innate, but rather through magical implements. As a fan of the character, I can say I appreciated his additional notoriety that came with the retcon in the 90s. There is a reason he was the Green Lantern used in Kingdom Come. He had cool supporting characters like his daughter Jade, who was born with the powers of a Green Lantern natively inside of her, and his son Obsidian, who had shadow powers. Both of the kids were members of Infinity Inc., a team made up of the children of Golden Age superheroes set on Earth 2. Now, due to his powers drawing from magical artifacts, he had an extended lifespan, allowing him to be a mentor figure for the 90s Green Lantern, Kyle Rayner. He's had a few looks, and I'm actually particularly fond of the 90s updated look. As with most of the Golden Age characters, he has a pretty different design in the New 52 continuity set on that Earth 2. While the more traditional Golden Age-inspired Earth 2 has been restored into the DC multiverse, elements of the New 52 has carried over. For instance, Alan Scott has come out as a closeted gay man, and while at first I was reluctant to embrace the change for a character who has multiple wives and children, ultimately, it's made sense, and they've done really good things with that, such as him relating the experience of coming out as an older man to his son. I'm pretty happy with this direction for the character and for a resumed position in the DC universe. And while he's not exactly Superman, he does the job pretty well. Alan Scott, both in his superheroic identity and his civilian life, is a model of lawful good, and I'm happy to talk about him anytime. However, next time, we're going to be talking about a character who was invented to fill the role of the Man of Steel in some specific stories. But until then, stay super, man. All right. So it's weird that I go from Alan Scott into Iron Munro and not the next one after Iron Munro, but that I think I was trying to knock out a bunch of ones before I got to specifically a character that wasn't actually from the Golden Age. And I guess Iron Munro isn't actually from the Golden Age, but he's older than the character that's sort of older. It's weird. Like the next character after Iron Munro is Dynaman, who is an update, an Elseworlds update of Dan Dunbar, Dan the Dynamite, who was a sidekick from the Golden Age, but they haven't really done much with as a character outside of that. And then Iron Munro is a retcon character introduced to sort of explain Superman's absence in comics that came out, particularly in the late Bronze Age and like the post-Crisis era. So with that, let's move on to talking about Iron Munro for a minute. I have to admit, Iron Munro is one that I don't know as much about as I usually like to discuss with these characters, but I do feel pretty good at giving just sort of a basic explanation of who he is. And so I stand by this video. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And last time I noted that characters were thrust into the role of Golden Age Superman analog retroactively in the 80s and 90s because DC wanted one timeline to simplify things. In some cases, this was with established characters, like I mentioned last time with Alan Scott, but they also invented a handful of new ones, such as Iron Munro. Iron Munro was a creation of nostalgia buff Roy Thomas. Thomas was already instrumental in maintaining the relevance of DC Golden Age characters with his Earth 2 work, so he took up the task of keeping continuity as consistent as possible while still adhering to the new mandate. To that end, he mined early concept drawings of Superman and combined them with proto-Superman characters like Wily's the Gladiator to create a plainclothes hero with power comparable to Superman's when he first appeared. And I mean mostly plain clothes. He did try a costume once, it didn't stick. And full disclosure, I haven't actually read any stories with the character. I mostly know about him from reading articles about how DC made the new continuity work. But I'm all for super beings who eschew a costume, and also really enjoy the ones who have the sort of meat and potatoes early Superman type, of just being strong and tough, without much else going on. And while I personally prefer the complexity and ingenuity of the multiverse concept, if you need to have a linear timeline and still make stories that were supposed to involve Superman work, at least it's a character with a thought-out metatextual origin. I mean, they could have done a lot worse. And hey, next time, we're gonna talk about a scenario where they did a lot worse. On purpose. But until then, stay super, man. Yeah, so that's Iron Munro, and there's like this whole like Iron Munro Jr. thing that I don't think I addressed in the video. I can't fully explain it. Like what you need to know is that if they are referencing Iron Munro, it is a character who is supposed to be a Superman analog. And I think that the currently active character in comics is Iron Munro Jr., the son of the original Iron Munro, I think is the deal, but like, I don't quote me on that, just, or rather Google me on that. Next up is, however, the character I was really excited to talk about because it was a character that I really love the comic that he's from. So we're talking about Dynaman. But as I point out in the video, this actually is an extended video because I talk about a bunch of characters because I didn't want my search algorithm to be fucked up because I put in a whole bunch of Nazi characters. For reasons of the story, there's a lot of Nazi stuff because it is set in the Golden Age of comics, and it was a good segue into talking about Supermans who were based on Nazi kind of concepts like Master Man or Captain Nazi. And I just didn't want to have a whole bunch of videos where I was like, this is Captain Nazi. He's the equivalent of Superman, but he's a Nazi. He's from the Captain Marvel comics. I just didn't want to talk about all of them in videos because the way the world is. And like, I don't want to be promoting that or have anyone think I was promoting that. Like I had a coworker one time be like, oh, I can't believe you wrote all these things about a Nazi superhero. And she was understood that it was just part of the series that I write stuff about about characters and that I was talking about a fictional character, but it still bothered her that I was discussing Nazi characters at the time. She saw it on my Instagram, but it was when I was doing the social media threads. And that's a fair point. And so I don't want to just be like, look, here's a Nazi Superman character. So I discuss a bunch of them at the end of this video just to knock it out of the park. So this is a longer video, and enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and I am starting off this Superman Analogue video with a big spoiler warning for a great comic that was published 20 years ago. Today I want to talk about Dynaman from James Robinson's fantastic Elseworld series, The Golden Age. Now, Dynaman isn't exactly a character invented for the book. Rather, he is a heavily modified version of one. Specifically, he's an updated version of Dan the Dynamite, sidekick to hero TNT. The Golden Age is set after World War II, where all the heroes have come home from the war and are finding their lives a little more complicated in the reprehensible HUAC, House of Un-American Activities Committee, era of America. People have gotten older, dreams have been shattered, and some lost their emotional rocks. Dan, the once Dynamite, was recruited by the Americommando to become a new breed of hero that Americans could look up to. They used tissue samples from the Golden Age atom, along with other subjects to augment the already explosive hero. They transformed Dan into a being with impossible strength and speed, as well as the power of flight. His durability was only limited by his theoretically limitless stamina. He was a beacon for everyone, a symbol of a hero who didn't hide behind a mask. Combined with his explosive fists, the character was the most powerful hero ever in a world without Superman. And this is where the spoilers kick in like, whoa. Seriously, stop if you don't want to be spoiled for a 20-year-old comic. We good? Okay. So, the Americommando was actually the brain-swapping Ultrahumanite, a Golden Age villain. He positioned himself to become a powerful politician and placed the brain of his ally into a newly created body of a virtual god. That ally being Adolf Hitler. So, bam! The greatest real-world villain of the era was in the body of the most powerful hero to date. They used their position to try to eliminate threats, but when revealed, decided just to murder everyone, and came up pretty close. Fortunately, Alan Scott showed up to hold off Dynaman. The battle is epic, and involves so many forgotten characters getting their moment to shine. It's the thing that cemented my love of the Golden Age Green Lantern, not to mention Johnny Quick, who was the POV for the book. I highly recommend anyone who hasn't read it to check it out. And I should note that even with the twist spoiled, the book is fantastic. I reread it often. If you haven't but enjoy these Superman Analogue videos, please read it, check it out. Nowadays, it's often listed as JSA, The Golden Age, but whatever's on the cover, the story is amazing. Now for those worried, Dan the Dynamite lived on in the mainstream DC Comics, being a part of a team of aged sidekicks called Old Justice, that had the occasional run-in with Young Justice. Now this is where I'm going to go off script a little bit, because back when I was doing these as semi-daily Twitter threads, it didn't feel like such a big deal to detour into some Nazi-themed villains that were utilizing the Superman archetype in negative ways. But I don't want to make multiple weeks of videos about Nazi characters, so I'm just going to knock them out right here. The first one that comes to mind for me is an actual example from World War II, which is Captain Nazi, a Captain Marvel villain. Obviously, the character was a representation of how flawed the ideology was. He took the fascist concepts of individual supremacy that is so popular with right-wing groups and personified them. It's the dark side of the Superman ideal, the Overman. However, the character is also intertwined with the creation of another analog, Captain Marvel Jr., and so has persisted in comics, often being the representative of neo-Nazi groups now. His connection with Captain Marvel Jr. is indicative of the nature of good rising to meet the evil. And Captain Nazi is a powerful foe. Through Nazi eugenics, he's strong, fast, and durable enough to battle Captain Marvel. He has cybernetic eyes to give him augmented senses, he inhales a gas that gives him the power of flight. This makes him a villain to be reckoned with, and a very clear Superman analog. But I am getting mad just talking about the character. He was a joke when I first read about him, a farce in my mind because of how outdated the philosophy that birthed him was. However, that ideology appeals to some, and we must all be like Captain Marvel Jr. here. No matter how badly a vile ideology wounds us, we can't let that stop us from trying to live up to the ideals of heroism. Sadly, that heroism is often defined by the evil which Captain Nazi represents. Next up, we have Masterman from Marvel's Invaders comics, which was a Bronze Age cleanup effort for Marvel's continuity. Basically, he's a later attempt by the Nazis to get the super soldier serum right after the US's success with Captain America, and this one is refined and thus gives him greater power. Stop me if these sound familiar: super strength, speed, invulnerability, and flight. I don't have much to say about this character beyond that he was intentionally a pastiche of Superman, but a Nazi! Gasp! He was powerful enough to take on Namor, who's already made this list. And as far as designs go, it's surprisingly similar to Captain Nazi. Really, it's just a palette swap. I guess both are just coming from the same angle of Nazi version of Superman, and there's only so much iconography that fits that one-to-one. Alright, let's move on to neo-Nazis. There was the father character from Stormwatch. He was a character that was obsessed with Nietzschean ideal of the Superman. He was a product of an experiment to create a virus that would kill all non-white Europeans and to engineer superhumans to rule the leftovers. He has an exposed face that gives him a Red Skull vibe, but with short blonde hair and reliance on a force field for his powers, which kind of evokes the Miracle Man style. He battled Stormwatch and was able to hold off the entire team for a good length of time, and this was one of their first missions under Warren Ellis's run, and it gave us a chance to highlight them working together to overcome a more powerful foe. Ellis's thesis in Stormwatch was that classic ideas of superheroism were dangerous, at best non-productive, that greater steps had to be taken to improve the world, as evidenced by the High and his group, as well as his later run on the Authority. It's no accident that he opened his team fighting and ultimately overcoming a Nazi Superman. Father represents the dark side of the Superman ideal. People can do unspeakable things thinking they're doing good. We need to be mindful of that. People need to wonder if they've become a faceless Nazi to someone. The last one I want to mention here are the Super Stormtroopers from Big Bang Comics, though these are more accurately a direct reference to Captain Marvel and his family. These three showed up in a story where the heroic Thunder Girl's powers were stolen and used to make Nazi Supermen. It was a fun way to pit characters based off of DC's Golden Age superheroes against Fawcett's Golden Age superheroes, highlighting quirks of their early power sets, like Ultiman, their Superman analog, being able to leap and not fly. Guess I'm gonna have to talk about Big Bang Comics next, huh? And if you're thinking that Nazis are cartoonish relics of the past, that they couldn't rise today, and that people are in no danger of encouraging it, you really need to look at the news. I wrote this in 2019, well before the Capitol uprising, and I think we're all aware that there is a certain sect of people that this kind of ideology, perhaps dressed up in stars and stripes, really appeals to. And that's really frustrating and needs to be combated. Anyway, I'm glad to knock these ones out. Next time we're going to be talking about a much more uplifting character, but until then, stay super, man. Yeah, so that's our marathon of Nazi characters. This exists, and I have to be frank about that. So yeah, I didn't want to like give away the twist too quickly about Dynaman. So yeah, I hope I didn't spoil it for anyone who was really looking forward to reading it. But it's also a comic book from my high school age, so you know it's. the spoilers are you know whatever. I'm sorry, I can't help it. Like I tried to be coy. Anyway, moving on, we are going to wrap up our Golden Age-ish kind of discussions, because we're going to talk about more characters who are from the Golden Age in concept, but not actually from that era in terms of publishing. And by that I mean characters who are throwback retro characters. And so we're going to move on to Big Bang Comics, and these are fun because Big Bang actually really appreciated me doing videos about their characters. I got retweets and I got featured on the website for the company. And that is pretty cool. I just have to say that part. Like, I like Big Bang a lot. It's a fun series that continues to put out issues. You know, it's got a very scattershot publishing history, but it's a lot of fun. And so Thunder Girl is a really fun one, and it's based on the original Captain Marvel about Shazam, and that is of course the character that I truly resonate with. And so it's always fun to find a Captain Marvel analog, and they clearly qualify as Superman analogs by way of being that first initial fork that I like talking about, that Shazam split with Superman. So here we go, and enjoy. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And last time, at the end of the video, I did an Ubermensch roundup, and during that I brought up Big Bang Comics. So I might as well get into their Superman analogs. I'll start with my personal favorite of the line, Thunder Girl. So Big Bang was founded on doing love letters to the Golden and Silver Age books, but really invested in those without the brevity or meta commentary that other efforts had. This was a whole lineup of clever homages. ThunderGirl filled 2 roles for the line. She was from Earth B, the Golden Age setting, and was their answer to Captain Marvel, a slot that was also sometimes filled by Mighty Man on loan from Erik Larsen. But at some point she found her way over to Earth A, the Silver Age setting, and started playing the part of Silver Age Supergirl. In her initial form, she was a librarian named Molly Wilson, who shouted "Alakazam!" to be struck by the magical lightning of nature and given superpowers. It was a pretty spot-on nod to the Big Red Cheese, complete with similar villains. For a fan like me, this was great. When she found herself on Earth A, Molly's powers went crazy and she became trapped in her powered form, so she took to wearing a wig for her secret identity. She also took mentorship from Ultiman, their direct Superman parallel, furthering the Supergirl comparison. Now, Big Bang is doubly a nostalgia trip for me. I discovered them in the early internet days and voraciously read about them, but means of reading the actual books weren't available. Years later, I was finally able to get a hold of these love letters to comics history, and they did not fail. Nowadays, Big Bang is back, doing a new series of Big Bang adventures, which ThunderGirl has appeared in. It's great to see the character in new stories. That said, the reason I don't have more to say is that she's a fairly straightforward, albeit very solid, tribute to 2 of my favorite characters. She has a bit of a nature theme, but doesn't stray too far into that. She's a perfect representative of Golden Age Fawcett books, which I love to death, as well as Silver Age Supergirl books, which I really enjoy. Definitely check out the current series and see if you can dig up some of her past adventures. Now, even though my Captain Marvel bias leads me to think the most fondly of ThunderGirl, she's also far more straightforward than tomorrow's offering. So next time we'll be talking about Ultiman. But until then, stay super, man. So yeah, I think the only thing I lacked to note in this video is that ThunderGirl has continued to appear in more modern Big Bang stuff. And like, I note that there's more modern Big Bang stuff, but like specifically like include any art from those more modern ones, which I've been reading. I fell off at some point, and I need to go back and read a bunch more, assuming that they've been publishing at a consistent rate, which is always a risk with Big Bang. But regardless, it's a line of characters and books that I've always really enjoyed. And so here's the next one, which is their literal Superman analog. And so one that I think doesn't really require that much explanation for why he's on this series. Hey everyone, I'm Kay Sagan. And guess what? After last week, we're going to be talking about some more Big Bang comics. Today we're on one of the more one-to-one Superman analogs that I will be discussing in this series, and that is Ultiman. The character was initially called Ultraman, but was later renamed as Ultiman for reasons that I'm not certain about, but I would speculate was to distinguish him from a certain size-changing Japanese superhero. As with all of Big Bang comics, Ultiman is a direct homage to Golden and Silver Age DC comics. In this case, even having both an Earth A and B version to represent the different eras. The two have some differences, but the consistent part is that Chris Kelly is exposed to a meteor and gains superpowers. The Golden Age Earth B version, a la the Earth 2 Superman, starts out weaker, jumping, not flying, but never has any of the weaknesses of the Earth A version. Also, he has a belt, and doesn't wear gloves. He also has some shades of Captain America, being a 4F rejected from the army during World War II. He also happens to be one of the few characters to have been adapted, in this case into the Big Bang TV special, Knights of Justice, which I have not seen. The Earth A version ends up with a longer story and tons of Silver Age style shenanigans. For one thing, his identity is publicly known, so to have privacy, he pretends to be his own deceased twin, the way Daredevil used to. Ultiman took advantage of the death of his criminal brother Carl to give himself a secret identity and some solitude outside of his secret citadel, where he would take refuge inside an extinct volcano. The Earth A version also needs to recharge his powers from the initial meteor encounter, but doing so radioactively poisons him more each time. However, he he has the full suite of Silver Age Superman powers from the get-go to offset this weakness. From this position of having 3 identities, Ultiman at first tried to make time for Lori Lake, a Lois Lane-style character. Unfortunately, as his body developed resistance to the atomic radiation of the ultra-uranium meteor that he was initially exposed to, Ultiman eventually had to take refuge from the public eye. He ended up marrying Arlene Arliss, who was more of a Lana Lang type figure, and tried to establish a family while living in seclusion. The relationship didn't work. Arlene did not really care for the life of solitude, and was concerned about the radioactive properties of the meteor and how they would impact her daughter. Meanwhile, Ultiman developed a greater resistance to the meteor, requiring larger and larger dosage of radiation each time to gain powers, and experiencing more severe side effects each time. As I noted last time, the Earth A Ultiman played a mentor role for Thundergirl, but we get stories set in the future where his daughter Ultragirl takes over as preeminent hero of the world. But that's a story for another day. For now, let me end with a recommendation for anyone who enjoys extremely retro stories of Superman to dig up Ultiman. Many of the comics are available online, and Big Bang is putting out new stories. It's a great palate cleanser when you need to get away from modern comics. Ultiman initially comes across as a very straightforward, simple take on the Superman archetype, in a very plain blue and yellow costume. But there are wonderful layers of depth to the character, developing a really robust world and setting. This is the promise of Big Bang, after all, telling classic stories, but with additional narrative complexity that the more mature medium can afford. So check out Ultiman, and then tune in next time when we'll be talking about his daughter, Ultragirl. But until then, stay super, man. So yeah, Ultiman is a fun one that has a very Byzantine kind of history. I think the only thing I should have noted is that after this one, like I note the Daredevil parallels in terms of his weird secret identity situation. And actually in Daredevil, they have since actually brought back Matt Murdock's fake twin brother and made him a real character. So that is a thing that happened in the comics that kind of changed the thing I was saying about Ultiman. But that's not a huge difference, and we're going to move on to a character I know less about. Like, I've read a few of her stories, but I just haven't seen as much with Ultragirl as I have for her father. But yeah, here's Ultragirl, the equivalent to Supergirl in the future, where Thundergirl was Supergirl in the 60s, I guess would be the best way to look at these two characters. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And for the last couple of weeks, we've been talking about Big Bang Comics for my Superman Analogue videos. This week, let's keep that tradition going by talking about Ultiman's daughter, Ultragirl. Ultragirl is Christine Kelly, the grown-up future timeline daughter of the Ultiman of Earth A. Her stories were possible because, due to being a retroactively created character, Ultiman's timeline could be more developed and filled out than a continuously published entity. So while Thundergirl filled the role of Silver Age Supergirl for Big Bang, Ultragirl was the version of Supergirl for their Legion of Superhero equivalent, the Pantheon of Heroes. She got her powers by absorbing all of the radiation of the meteor that powered her father, and thus shared all of his abilities. Originally, she tended to her father every time he recharged his powers, but the meteor one day exploded. He was thought dead, though he actually went into hiding since he found that he now drained her life force whenever he was close to her. So she went from dutiful daughter to torchbearer, thinking that she was carrying on his legacy. Now, while the Earth A Ultiman was designed to look intentionally like a Silver Age fixture, Ultragirl has a Bronze Age design, what with the thigh-high boots. Now, I've only read maybe a couple stories with her specifically, so I don't have that much more to say, but I love Big Bang material, so I'm excited to see more. And as far as codenames go, Ultragirl is a pretty solid one. So next time, we'll be talking about a different character named Ultragirl, but until then, stay super, man. Man, Ultragirl would be a really good segue into talking about the Legion of Superheroes, but it's not. And so instead, it's me talking about a character who is also just named Ultragirl. So with that, we're going to talk about a Marvel character who has powers very similar to Ms. Marvel / Carol Danvers / Captain Marvel, or at least how she initially had her powers. She's had power boosts since that. So this was a really fun one. It's a Valley Girl Supergirl. It's Ultragirl. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and have you all checked out the trailer for Kamala Khan as Miss Marvel? Pretty cool, huh? I mean, it's a little different from the comics, but I'm excited to see this character who is something of a protege to the Carol Danvers Captain Marvel. However, Carol Danvers once had another protege, one who was a pretty solid Superman analog herself, Ultragirl. Now, Ultragirl was a Kree-human hybrid named Tsu-Zana, or Tsu-Zana, who was designed as a Valley Girl nod to Supergirl. She was an aspiring model before her powers kicked in and she became too buff, which is cool. Clearly, she was conceived of before the modern era of fitness Instagrammers. As I mentioned when I discussed Carol Danvers, Kree hybrids seem to produce far more powerful offspring than their parent races. As a result, she has the same power levels as the OG Miss Marvel in terms of strength, durability, flight, etc. Think 90s Rogue. She palled around with the New Warriors, never joined officially, but all the same was shunned after the Stamford incident like the rest. I think she was on Cap's side during Civil War, but joined the Initiative after, where she kind of made friends with Thor Girl, who I eventually will get to. While with the Initiative, Carol Danvers took her under her wing and decked her out with her old costume. Considering their similar powers and origins, this worked pretty well for me. My understanding is that she's still running around, though sans the OG Miss Marvel outfit due to the events of Dark Avengers, but I'm not up on her more modern adventures. Thinking about her main outfit, the baggier pants give a flexible work style, kind of a military vibe, which is accentuated by the zipper line, looking like a formal wear jacket a la Shazam. The sleeveless look made it more relaxed. And orange is pretty rare for superhero costumes, but it works here. It's nice to know they have a SoCal-style Supergirl running around. Maybe I'm just nostalgic for Clueless, or 90210, or the OC, but it's nice to have a classic-style character from a very different place than NYC, or a version of NYC. Next time, we'll be talking about a different kind of Superwoman. But until then, stay super, man. So I know Ultragirl has made some appearances here or there. I am not very caught up with the character. I can't say that I frankly have read that many of her appearances. I've more read about her and then read like excerpts from her appearances. It's pages and panels. So hopefully this was a pretty comprehensive description of the character. I tried to be vague in terms of her more modern appearances just because I only kind of know what she's been up to. Next up is another one-and-done character, a character from a series that just ran and then like doesn't have anything else to sort of go with. And I, for some reason, so I remember writing this one later in the timeline of the written thread. So I forget why I bumped up the appearance of Dynasty in the video series order. I think maybe I just wanted to do more female characters, or I can't remember exactly why. Maybe it just like occurred to me and I just wanted to talk about it. But here's Dynasty from Bill Willingham's Pantheon. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and sometimes the reason you create a Superman analog is because you want to tell a story about superheroes in general. Such is the case with today's example, Dynasty, from Bill Willingham's maxi-series Pantheon. Pantheon was a series about some very familiar heroes in a world where, at least when the book opens, the heroes have won. But peace brings its own challenges. Willingham intentionally played with race and gender in Pantheon, which I remember being pretty progressive for the 90s. Dynasty is their equivalent to Superman, complete with an alien origin and identical power set. Meanwhile, the warrior woman Minerva is their Wonder Woman XP. Willingham is best known for the Vertigo series Fables, which played with the tropes of fairy tale characters. This is an earlier work, but has a similar sense of the world, with a desire to subvert traditional superhero roles. To that end, many origins of characters are left intentionally vague, leaving the audience to assume that the unexplained is our familiar set of expectations, only to be surprised when they come to twist our understanding. Pantheon shows us a superwoman struggling to keep hard-won peace together as relationships strain and dissolve. There are twists, and of course villainy eventually rears its head, but Dynasty was a wonderful, strong lady who was on top of things. She was a beacon to show the others the way. Next time, we're going to talk about a character who didn't really have their shit together. But until then, stay super, man. Yeah, Dynasty is fun. All these characters are generally fun. I'm pretty pro Superman Analogue. That's why I do this series. Next up is a less fun one, just because it's from a movie that's not very good, but opened with a strong hook. And it's basically the first half is actually pretty good, and the back half is not. So that means we're talking about Hancock. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And not all Superman Analogue characters are notable because they are successful at their job, such as today's character, Hancock. And up front, I just need to get this out of the way. Obviously, Hancock is played by Will Smith, and Will Smith has been in the news recently, and I actually held off on this video until some of that died down a bit, but it was in the works when the thing happened. So I just want to acknowledge it, but also say I'm not weighing in on any of that. Anyway, Hancock was a Will Smith vehicle from 2008. It centered around the titular character being Superman, but an alcoholic hobo. And damn, was that a cool sounding premise. And you know what? 2/3 of the movie lived up to it, too. Then, it gets bad. But up until that point, it makes a very good point about how society responds to image and presentation. This is a real sub-theme for Superman. The very costume that the OG wears is meant to make people feel at ease and comfortable. It reflects a circus strongman because that's something that we can understand. In the movie, after years of being a misanthrope, Hancock gets a publicist in the form of Jason Bateman, fresh off his Arrested Development renaissance, who cleans him up and gets him into a traditional superhero outfit, though very Bryan Singer X-Men, but those were the times. Doing so makes people trust him for the first time ever, and his job gets easier. But then they got to the third act and had to wrap up the movie and realized they didn't have a strong plot, just a fun premise. So they crammed in this plot about warring gods with Charlize Theron, and it seriously doesn't work. And in this era of overwhelming superhero media to consume, it's hard to imagine going back and watching this movie. But damn, don't I remember being excited for it when I first saw the trailer. It was Will Smith in his prime doing what looked like a pretty good satire of Superman. Too bad it was just a fun premise. Next time, we'll be talking about a Superman that didn't live up to his potential as well. But until then, stay super, man. I really wish that movie was better. I'm just going to say that first half of it, and like the trailer sold the movie very well, and then the actual movie is not very good. But the special effects were pretty good. Like one thing about Superman Analogue stuff, and now it's like hard to understand the weight of it, but it was a long time before special effects got good enough that it felt very real, or looked, good enough in movies to be like movie caliber. And Hancock was a step along the way in terms of making it look like you can have a flying superhero that didn't just look like he was being green screened in. Like love Christopher Reeve stuff, but it doesn't look as impressive once you've seen it a lot of times. And so the special effects have continued to get better and better over the years. And this was a really big movie in terms of that. Next up is a story that I wrote when I was very sad. The next couple I remember happening while my grandfather was passing away. And so I wasn't sharing on social media that was happening. But I needed to just be kind of mournful. So I talked about a sort of sad little one-off story about the Superman that wasn't in the Wildstorm Comics universe. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And last week we talked about a Superman analog that didn't live up to his potential. This week I want to talk about one that was never given the chance to live up to its potential. Characters created by Warren Ellis, a complicated figure to discuss in comics, have popped up a number of times in the series. He was very interested in the Superman archetype, and in Planetary, he dealt with what it was like for a world to be robbed of one. Planetary was a book about exploring the weirdness of comics and sci-fi. It was a beautiful book that deconstructed something I loved in every issue. In issue 10, we saw a world much like Krypton, with a being much like Zor-El. With their world near death, he and his mate pinned their hopes and dreams on one last rocket, sent from their world just before the end. And tragically, we're given to know that this last rocket was the straw that broke the camel's back with their world's fragile gravitational field, a morbid bit of irony for the reader. The baby found its way to Earth, and we get such a familiar scene, only to have that hope dashed by a callous metahuman. This was a tale of cynical greed destroying the wonder in the world. In the same issue, we also see a Green Lantern-type creature dissected and his power sent off to create Lamplighter from Apollo and Midnighter's first team. We see Diana shot down as she leaves Themyscira. We see Hope die. And that, unfortunately, is the end of that story. Next time, we'll be talking about a character who, under different circumstances, could have served as the Superman of his world. But until then, stay super, man. So this next one was another one that I wrote while I was very sad, and I remember specifically writing it while I was waiting for a bunch of deliveries late at night at my job. So this is a time capsule right there in terms of memories, and it's a character that is a time capsule of a character, Marcus Aelius, who people have pointed out there's a lot of similarities to Exo Manowar. There's similarities to a lot of characters, frankly. It's the concept of a Roman centurion today, but with space tech, is not ridiculously novel unto itself. But he's from that window in time when I got into comics initially, like when I was first really starting to buy Superman proper comics. He was a character that was first appearing. And so it's a character that always stood out to me because he's in universe a Superman analog. Like he's from the 0 Hour timeline where he replaces Superman, full stop. So it felt like a worthwhile character to discuss here. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and this week I'm going to do a pretty literal Superman analog, in that the point of the first story featuring this character was that he was the equivalent of Superman from an alternate timeline. So let's talk about the Alpha Centurion. The Alpha Centurion first appeared during 0 Hour. You remember 0 Hour, right? That event that DC did in the 90s to try to clean up the mess of continuity that had occurred after Crisis on Infinite Earths? That event. Anyway, during 0 Hour, Superman was flung at one point to an alternate timeline where no one had any idea who he was, and the hero of Metropolis was this unfamiliar face to our eyes. The Alpha Centurion, it turned out, was a hero from Rome named Marcus Aelius, who had been taken into space by aliens and given weaponry and cybernetic upgrades. When he returned to Earth, he became the premier hero of his world, and even became Lois Lane's paramour. Being Superman's equivalent from this world, he and the Man of Steel worked together as a team until the possible destruction of his timeline threatened his loyalty. Eventually, a version of Marcus Aelius from the mainstream DC reality showed up. Sadly, due to not preceding Superman in this timeline, meant that he never gained much fame. When he first showed up, he appeared in a number of arcs, such as the Sins of the Father arc, where Superman was put on trial for the destruction of Krypton, and he got a mini that went into his history and established that the alien benefactors for him weren't really so benevolent. Which is probably a good thing, since otherwise he basically is a Roman-themed version of a Green Lantern, or really a Lensman. Design-wise, I'm not a huge fan of his 0 Hour look, but I really dig his appearance when he showed up for real. It's a nice blend of historic and superhero, even if not all of the elements quite go together historically. Kind of like how Thor doesn't really look like what Vikings actually looked like, but look like what we think they look like, and then made into a superhero. I really love the gold chestplate and helmet, even if they're more Grecian in style than Roman. The gold accents from his armor go really well then with the purple bodysuit and the white cape. I just think it's a fantastic look. His powers are sort of a techier set, but not too far off from guys like Birdman. He's able to make energy constructs that can act as shields or as weapons, plus he has table stake powers like flight. He'd make for a solid cinematic character and would fit right in with something like Ruby. Unfortunately, I'm not really sure what the character's been up to. After all of the retcons and revisions that DC has been been through, the universe is pretty packed, and the Alpha Centurion has never really made their mark. However, I would love if someone wanted to champion this character. Speaking as a classical studies major and a sci-fi nerd, the concept of Roman Centurion from space just really does my heart proud. Lastly, while I was working on this video, I was thinking about how the original premise of the character was the world's premier superhero in a world that never had Superman. And it occurred to me that the character has several similarities to the Golden Age hero, the Dart, who I discovered through comics tropes. While I have no evidence of direct inspiration, it certainly feels like the type of character that would have been conceived of in the Golden Age, and then the version that we are getting is some sort of 90s update of it. And while this is pure speculation, it's interesting to think about what a prominent superhero would look like if the medium wasn't so heavily influenced by Superman. Anyway, next time we'll be talking about a different, literal analog of Superman from a different reality. But until then, stay super, man. I wouldn't mind seeing more of the Alpha Centurion these days, but in the meantime, I'm okay with just sort of remembering him as a cool concept of a character. Speaking of cool concepts of a character, there is the Pocket Universe Superboy, who is definitely a concept better than execution. Not to be too negative, because I do overall like the story that he's from, but he's definitely a character that, like, feels dated. It feels very much of a time where we were very anti anything pre-crisis with Superman. And so there's like this like negative streak that I don't really like, especially from the Byrne issues, like less so from the Levitz issues where he appears from the Legion of Superheroes. Yeah, working on this story was a big exploration into me and my Legion fandom, and leads into our discussion of Legion of Superheroes books, which actually is how I got connected with Jim Fetters, who is from the Long Live the Legion podcast, which is now a part of the Certain POV podcast network, and you should check out their YouTube channel as well. Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and while we're talking about alternate reality Superman analog characters, let's spend some time with the Superboy of the Pocket Universe. So, the Legion of Superheroes had always been built on a foundation that they were inspired by the legends of Superboy. They even developed time travel so they could go into the past and introduce themselves to their hero. The team grew and expanded over the years to become a major fixture of the DC universe, but that tie to Superboy always remained. However, when DC reconstructed their continuity after Crisis on Infinite Earths, it was decided that their Superman had never been Superboy. But they didn't do a full reboot of the Legion, so things got weird. It starts with Cosmic Boy going back in time and encountering Superman, who doesn't know him. Wanting to investigate further, several members of the Legion travel back to Smallville and find Smallville intact as they knew it. All the staples are there, and everyone who should remembers the Legion, and it matches up with the continuity that they had known prior to the Crisis. But then Superboy betrays them, and several of the Legionnaires are forced to flee into the future, where they encounter Superman, a Superman who doesn't know them, a Superman who had never been Superboy. Chaos ensues, and they all end up back in Smallville. You see, it turns out that this reality is a small sliver in space-time that they have been going to that was constructed by the Time Trapper, a Legion villain, as a plot. However, Superboy was still a good person, and he schemed to bring in Superman to save the Legion while pretending to still be loyal to the Time Trapper. This, by the way, is where they first introduced the idea that kryptonite from different realities don't work on alternate reality Kryptonians. Prior to the Crisis, it didn't matter which Earth you were from, kryptonite, regardless of the color, was kryptonite. With Superman disrupting this phase of the Time Trapper's plot, Superboy and the Legion of Superheroes go back to the future to face the Time Trapper. All things considered, it's an enjoyable story. We covered it in greater detail on the Men of Steel podcast, so check out that conversation. While there are parts that don't hold up that well, it is an interesting comparison between the two continuities. The older defunct continuity and the newly cemented one. Ultimately, this Superboy was created as a foil so that we could understand what the new Superman is all about. The story then ends with a pretty sad scene as Superboy gives his life to save the Legion. We get a really touching scene with Mon-El, who reflects on how Superboy had been his brother for all those years. It was a valid attempt at sending off this era of the Legion. However, this would not be the last time we see that alternate version of Superboy. During Zero Hour, the character shows up, ripped from his encounter in the future, to meet the 90s 90s version of Superboy. This is pretty clearly the same pocket dimension version of the character, particularly because 0 Hour is so invested in the post-crisis continuity. This character would go on to show up again in Hypertension, which was a Superboy story as he traveled through different timelines, but that's where it gets trickier with continuity. The thing I have to emphasize is that this is not Superman when he was a boy. This is a unique character created to explain continuity issues and wrap up a story that people have been following since the 50s. It also created a fertile setting for future stories, however controversial, which I will come back to at a later date. The post-crisis era of Superman can usually be described as throwing out the baby with the bathwater, and so there's a lot you can criticize about the story of the Pocket Universe Superboy. But despite all the aspirations for modernity, the story was how I was introduced to a large amount of Silver Age tropes of the character, and it is a loving tribute to Superboy's period with the Legion of Superheroes. And that's why I want to spend some time talking about Legion of Superhero characters who fit the bill of Superman Analogue. And next time, it makes sense to pick up with another character created in the wake of the Crisis on Infinite Earths. But until then, stay super, man. So that's the Pocket Universe Superboy. The only regret I have about that video is that I hadn't read the 5 years later stuff at the time, and I would have included some more information about that period because I'd read the death of I figured he was done, that the death of Superboy covered it, and that he existed until 0 Hour, and that was basically fine. I didn't understand that the Legion timeline got further mucked with, creating the whole Valor situation and whatnot from the Legion timeline. And so the 5 years later stuff, and I'll just fill you in if you're not familiar. 5 years later was this jumping off point for the Legion of Superheroes. So it literally jumped 5 years into the future of their characters with a whole bunch of big story changes. And what I thought happened as just part of the 5 years later jump was a rewrite of Valor becoming the more important character. But that wasn't the case. It was actually a story that happened shortly into the run of the 5 years later, where because of the muckings of the Time Trapper being killed by Mon-El, our timeline got reset into this magical world, and Gloranthe had to reset it, taking the role of the Time Trapper in recreating the timeline, and thus put Mon-El and then renamed him Valor into the space that would be occupied by Superboy. And this led to some interesting stories. It doesn't really matter that much for this point in the timeline, but at the very end, going into 0 Hour, that Superboy is called back on, and they address the fact that the Legionnaires both have memories of that Superboy and also a lack of memories, and that's part of the whole rewriting that occurs as part of 0 Hour. It's not big stuff, and it goes from that Legion of Superheroes book where we see him briefly into the Superboy book for 0 Hour, which I do talk about. So it's not like I'm feeling like I miss out a ton of information on the character, but it's a character I'm fascinated by, and I appreciated his appearances. So I was sad that there was information that I didn't have, that I didn't know that I didn't have when I was discussing the character in this video. Next up, we're going to talk about another retcon character, and this one is Laurel Gand, who gets retconned as a result of the Gloranthe timeline mucking that occurs. She is created to replace Supergirl in the Gloranthe timeline, which again I thought was just how it sort of worked post 0 Hour or post Crisis, and just where the 5 year jump occurred. But it's not. And I this is another character where I really wish I had read all of the 5 years later stuff, because I had read her post-crisis stuff and thought I had a pretty good sense of it. And I had read the Andromeda stuff from Legionnaires, but I didn't understand the SW6 stuff enough. And I didn't know about things like, I didn't know that Laurel Gand, she dies in the 5 years later timeline. Not the Andromeda version, the SW6 version, but the version from the modern day Legion timeline is eventually killed. And it's a really kind of nothing of a story that is very disappointing. And so I would have ranted a bit about that. So yeah, that's the frustration I have. But otherwise, I do like the video because I like the character, and this is supposed to be a celebration of these characters.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Last time, I talked about how, in the wake of Crisis on Infinite Earths, that Superboy's removal from continuity left a void in the Legion. Well, Superboy wasn't the only Kryptonian whose absence had to be explained. See, his cousin, Supergirl, was another Superman analog and heavy hitter on the Legion. To fill her void, several characters were introduced, and one of which was Laurel Gand. As the name would suggest, Laurel was retroactively created to be a descendant of Gand, best known as Mon-El, who I've talked about before, although in most timelines where Laurel existed, he was known as Valor. Like Gand, she's a Daxamite, with all the powers and weaknesses that entails. Now, her first name, Laurel, is derived from Laurel Kent, a pre-crisis descendant of Superman who they then had to do some retcons with post-crisis. Frankly, I should probably talk about her next. When Laurel first showed up, it was the 5-year gap. She was presented in a post-apocalyptic design, as most of the team were at this point, wearing a leather ensemble with a red cape. Meanwhile, she was shown in flashbacks to have originally worn a distaff counterpart to Lars' traditional red costume with the blue cape. This character would go on to fill the role of Supergirl in all the stories set during the 5-year gap, including having a crossover with a time-lost Superman, a classic wink to his team-ups with the Legion from the past. Then, in this period leading up to the next major reboot, 0 Hour, again, things got more complicated. Laurel was presented as one of the SW6 Legionnaires, which was a group that was originally thought to be young clones of existing Legion members, but actually revealed to be versions of the characters plucked from earlier points in their history. This version of Laurel adopted the name Andromeda and took an orange outfit that would go on to be her signature look. Now, the original version of Laurel was presented as Supergirl as if she had gone through the 5-year gap where things had gone kind of awry. So she was a bit more serious and had seen some stuff. Meanwhile, the SW6 version, Andromeda, was a younger character who was a little less serious and a little bit more of a romantic. Post 0 Hour, as was the case with many of the SW6 Legionnaires, the newly rebooted Legion adopted their names and designs. So in this case, Laurel Gand became officially Andromeda. This one, however, was introduced as a member of the White Triangle Cult, which was a group of Daxamite supremacists who saw their species as the superior race, which, when you consider how powerful they are, is hard to refute sometimes. But eventually this character got over her racism and joined a convent. Laurel Gand has been a part of several iterations of the Legion, including an appearance in the Superman the Animated Series episode New Kids in Town, where we got to see a flash forward to the Legion timeline. However, oftentimes she's been pushed aside to bring in more modern Supergirl characters, sometimes the Girl of Steel herself, sometimes others. I've always been a fan of Andromeda, however. I really like her orange outfit. It feels like its own style, rather than just being a Supergirl clone. It has the same logic that Laurel Kent's design had, where if you're invulnerable, you might not be as concerned about modesty. And the star pattern going on the black stripe was a really nice touch. And while she'll always feel kind of like an understudy to Supergirl, and probably not anyone's first choice for blonde-haired powerhouse that can rip apart a starship with her bare hands, I've always liked Andromeda. The Legion can always have more flying bricks, in my opinion, and Laurel Gand was defined enough to stand out. However, next time, I should probably talk about Laurel Kent, the actual descendant of Superman. But until then, stay super, man.
Yeah, so that's the Laurel Gand video. Like I said, it's a good celebration of the character. I just wish I knew more about the 5 years later stuff before I wrote this video. And it's just a frustration because the way I write these videos is that I'm going off of memory and trying to talk about what is important to the character from my perspective, as opposed to doing a thorough history or anything of a character. So it's more of a, like, here's a quick summary for a layperson about a character and why they should matter to you, as opposed to comprehensive history. And so I'm not usually going into lots of information. Like, I'm not doing a deep dive on these characters. I'm trying to go off of the top of my head with, some supplementary information if I have to double check a thing, because it's based on my thoughts on the character. Next up is the video that frankly has one of our highest view counts of all time, and I have no idea why. But I have even had people ask me questions about the character from who are just friends who I don't really think watched my videos and just came up and asked like, oh, is it really a deal that she happens to like to be an exhibitionist? I don't know, something resonated about this video. So yeah, this is Laurel Kent. So check out one of our top viewed videos.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now last time I talked about Laurel Gand, the post-crisis solution to the problem of Supergirl having been erased from continuity. Now while she fills the role of Supergirl, she also is a callback to a different Legionnaire, Laurel Kent, the descendant of Superman. So here's the basic story. Laurel was created by Jim Shooter as a future descendant of Superman, but being 1,000 years removed from her powerful progenitor, she only inherited the Kryptonian 9 vulnerability, and otherwise was just a regular human. All things considered, however, this was a pretty great power to retain, especially since she didn't have the numbness aspect that we've seen with purely invulnerable beings like in the League of Supermen from DC's Legends of Dead Earth. And being invulnerable meant she didn't need to hold back for fear of injury, so she could strike as hard as she wanted and not break her hand. Also, this was the Legion of Superheroes after all, so she got a flight ring and thus had that part covered too. When she was first introduced, she used a pseudonym to conceal her identity when she met Superboy, Elna, a scrambling of Lane since she was also the descendant of Lois Lane as well. Superboy was smitten with her until he discovered that she was actually his descendant, and that the reason why he found himself so attracted to her was that she looked like the woman he'd eventually fall in love with. Now, I should note that Laurel was never a full member of the Legion of Superheroes. She was a trainee, but due to the incredibly lame rule that the Legion had back in the day, that every member was required to have a unique superpower, she was never allowed to become a full member. There are many Legionnaires who are invulnerable, after all, and her form of invulnerability wasn't even particularly unique, as she shared the Kryptonian weakness to kryptonite and magic. One thing I really liked about the character was that her powers influenced her personality. Being effectively invulnerable meant that she didn't feel the need to wear heavy clothes to protect herself from the elements. Her normal attire was basically just a bikini, and her most recognizable look was her wearing a poncho with a Superman symbol on it over said bikini. After the crisis, it took a minute to settle on how things would affect the Legion. Pocket Universe Superboy. So Laurel remained on the team until they decided to clean house. As a tie-in to the Millennium event from the late 80s, DC retconned the character as an imposter, revealing her to be one of the robotic Manhunters. This weirdly makes her also kind of connected to the Green Lanterns. I did not like this retcon, and many writers have since ignored it. Then, during the 5-year gap era for the Legion, time was rewritten to place a higher emphasis on Largand/Valor/Mon-El instead of Superboy. Laurel was merged with Supergirl and envisioned as a descendant of Largand, thus creating Laurel Gand, though the character does resemble more Supergirl than Laurel Kent. But since then, the character has popped up as an Easter egg in future presentations of the family tree of the House of El. This has led some to speculate that the Manhunter incarnation of Laurel was merely impersonating the real character. But some of those future versions of Laurel seem to have all of the Superman powers, so I think it's best just not to think about it too much. Laurel Kent was a really interesting take on the lineage aspect of the Legion of Superheroes. She didn't get special treatment because of her heritage, and while she was often sad that she would never be a full member, she was a steadfast friend to all of the recruits. Considering that she was initially created to have a really messed up flirtatious relationship with Superboy, it's cool to see that she went on to be the exhibitionist friend of all the Legionnaires. And for me, the Legion is best when it's a soap opera blended with high-stakes superheroics and science fiction. So I'm glad we got to have an interesting character who could be their emotional support and wouldn't get hurt in the process. Though she could also deliver some tough love. And honestly, what's tougher than Laurel Kent, the invulnerable girl of tomorrow? Next time, we're going to be continuing with characters from Legion of Superheroes who could stand in for Superman, with Dev-Im, the Knave of Krypton. But until then, stay super, man.
Yeah, so rewatching this video, I can't tell you why it was so highly viewed. It's super highly viewed considering that it was released before the channel had hit 1,000 viewers. And that's just a really interesting kind of metric on that thing. It makes me wonder, actually, if I had boosted this post at the time, what kind of numbers we would have attained. Not that I want to do that right now with a video that, is fairly old. But anyway, moving on. And likewise, that gets into the next character, which I likewise wish that I had read 5 years later, just so I can explain a little bit better what his version in 5 years later was. But that is a character that I think we saw some signs might be coming back, because the Legion is generally coming back right now in comics. This is, as of me making this is October 20th, 2025. And so there's a general push to bring the Legion back. So this is a Legion adjacent character. The next two are both Legion adjacent. They're not members of the Legions themselves, but they're from the timeline of the 30th century. So it's worth me bringing them up. So next up is Dev M, who is known as the Knave of Krypton and is from Superboy stuff, but he has since been retconned to be a Daxamite, and I believe he's back to being the Dev M. Like, he has like a brief appearance at the end of 5 years later, which I would have liked to have referenced, because he gets modified back into the form that we better know him as, the Kryptonian form. So that would have been worth like kind of discussing, just full stop. But that's Dev M. So let's take a look at the video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and are you ready for some more 30th century Superman analog characters? Well, as with everyone connected to the Legion of Superheroes, all of the various reboots get confusing, and for Dev M, the Knave of Krypton, this is no exception. Dev M started out as a Kryptonian juvenile delinquent that pestered the Silver Age Superboy. After getting his jollies in Smallville, he fled for more advanced times, traveling to the 30th century and kind of going straight by joining the intelligence agency of that era. I don't know if we've seen this much elsewhere, but this makes Dev M an example of a Wetworks Superman. Kind of like a 007 with powers, or maybe a Spectre from Mass Effect. He could fly around the galaxy investigating threats and taking decisive action. Now, as a morally gray, but not actually evil guy with the power of Superman, he participated in a lot of the big events of 80s Legion stories, such as the Great Darkness Saga. This is the Dev M that I'm most familiar with, but I will admit that my sampling is biased by the types of stories that tend to be collected in trade paperbacks. But this was a good niche for the character back in the day. The pre-Crisis Legion had a pretty impressive roster, so a guy with Superman's powers stood out, but didn't exactly upset the power curve. I mean, I guess all versions of the Legion of Superheroes, once they get further into their runs, have pretty impressive rosters, but particularly true for pre-Crisis. But then Crisis on Infinite Earths happened, and we weren't allowed to have other Kryptonians running around anymore. Now, I read that originally post-Crisis Dev M was made to be a psychic who could change his cells into Kryptonian ones, somewhat similar to how Colossus exchanged his organic matter for living steel. But I think that only showed up in a who's who and was never verified in any actual stories. However, after the 5-year gap and the time alterations that occurred at the beginning of that story, Dev M was recast as a deranged Daxamite criminal. After first fighting Valor in the 20th century, he traveled to the 30th century, where he became a remorseless butcher, even destroying the Earth's moon, sort of, after fighting a time-hopping Superman and Laurel Gand. The fact that this much more overtly evil villain is presented as the same character actually bothers me a bit, because we're losing out on what was kind of special about Dev M. Since then, I have read that he's been restored as a Phantom Zone criminal, so back to being Kryptonian, but, still just a villain, as far as I can tell, because I actually haven't seen him pop up anywhere since 0 Hour. Oh, and apparently this Jamoke was supposed to be Dev M in the Man of Steel movie. I mean, I'm fine with this being an Easter egg, but it would have been nice if we were clued in by the movie itself. Design-wise, Dev M first showed up wearing a purple version of the Silver Age Kryptonian clothing of the time. Once he got to the 30th century, he would wear a number of different jumpsuits. I particularly like the purple and orange jumpsuit that he would wear for much of his career during the Levitz era. Purple being a secondary color indicates his moral ambiguity, and the design feels kind of like what we would later see with characters like the Viltrumites in Invincible. Post the 5-year gap, he had a bit of a punk design, which is consistent with many of the characters of the time, but it feels so far afield from his previous design that it just contributes to him feeling like a wholly new character. Anyway, Superman types tend to be pillars of moral virtue or terrible villains, and it was nice to have Dev M out there back in the day as a cocky and selfish powerhouse that was ultimately not going to stand for anything really bad happening. In the advanced sci-fi settings of the Legion of Superheroes, you can get away with having lots of really powerful entities because technology has kept pace with them. And in that era, there were more powerful entities than just a Kryptonian, such as who we'll be talking about next time. But until then, stay super, man.
So yeah, this is another spot where I wish that I had read 5 years later before, and I'm glad that I finally did. It's a big read. The 2 omnibi are huge, so I don't want to say that this is not a labor of love. But yeah, that is also why we're going to pivot into some other more non 5 years later kind of characters and go into the Levitz era, which is what I know better in terms of Legions of Superhero stuff. Because obviously at some point I'm going to talk about Kent Shakespeare. I just wasn't that familiar with Kent Shakespeare until I read the 5 years later stuff. And now we're going to do him at some point on the series, but I don't know when. But that's not why he's not included in this first batch. But you know who is included in the first batch? Duplicate Boy, who I screwed up. I looked up his name because that made sense to me because I knew him as Duplicate Boy. And it's Ord Quelu, but in the Who's Who, it was reversed. It was Quelu Ord. And that is, I got pointed out was a screw up. And once the video goes up, I can't really change it. So it's corrected in the title, but not in the actual video when it gets posted. And you know, it's a bummer. This is a character who I knew from the Levitz run and thus didn't know most of his stories because he actually goes back well before that. But still fun character, and he's a powerhouse, man. He does appear post-Crisis, though, so that is an interesting one when we get into power levels in the post-Crisis Legion. Presumably, he's got his powers from Daxamite at that point. But you know, still an interesting power set.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, I mentioned last time that the 30th century in DC Comics had enough powerful beings that a rogue Kryptonian doesn't really mess with the power curve. And by that, I mean, in addition to villains like Mordru or Validus, there are also heroes, like Duplicate Boy, who make for a good, albeit overpowered, Superman analog. Duplicate Boy was one of the heroes of Lalor, another team of heroes of that era, something that I'm really glad existed for the sake of world building. His powers were copying any superpower he encountered, without any of the limitations that characters like Mimic or Super Skrull had. This meant that Duplicate Boy, who had his run-ins with Mon-El and the rest, could boast to have the classic Superman power sets, but he also had been around plenty of other heavy hitters, such as Colossal Boy, with whom he had a rivalry for Shrinking Violet's affection. Duplicate Boy was thus one of the most powerful heroes of pre-Crisis DC point blank, and it's not completely surprising that he hasn't appeared since. However, he wasn't without weaknesses. Duplicate Boy passed out when he tried to copy Validus's powers because it was too much for him, and sometimes he just forgets to turn on certain crucial powers, like invulnerability. Needless to say, he's also not particularly smart. Plus, he is a terrible boyfriend. But I mean, when you can go toe-to-toe with Superboy while warping magnetic fields like Cosmic Boy and simultaneously waging a psychic war with Saturn Girl, you're not going to let a couple minor weaknesses get you down. Duplicate Boy wasn't even the leader of his group. He wasn't the one that everyone looked to be inspired by, but he was definitely someone you wanted in your corner. Sometimes the Superman of your group plays the role of scrapper instead of older brother, and that fit Duplicate Boy. Design-wise, his costume had some of the crazy flourishes of the 70s era Legion. I enjoyed the Harlequin patterns around his neck and nethers. The green draws your eye, but also tells you that he's not as stalwart a hero as a primary colored Crusader. And like I said, we haven't gotten a version of the character post-Crisis as far as I'm aware. So this character lives in a time period when Kryptonians and beings who could copy their powers were able to move planets. But next time, we're going to talk about a mainstay of the Legion of Superheroes, one who has all the powers of Superman, but can only turn on one at a time. Until then, stay super, man.
Moving on, we are going to talk about Ultra Boy, who is such a fascinating character. And I think being in the Legion, he gets overshadowed because there's so many like heavy hitters. I really think the character has as a power set has a really cool hook to run his own book. And it's a shame that we've never had him really have his own like solo series, especially one set in the 20th century. He's been trapped in the 20th century before, but never have we just like followed him. He'd be a really fun book. But on that note, I think the video is fun. So check the video out.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, last time I talked about Duplicate Boy and how a weakness for him was forgetting to turn on necessary superpowers. But I wanted to spend today discussing a Superman analog who has all the right powers, a little stronger even, but can only use one at a time, Ultra Boy. As with pretty much every character from the Legion of Superheroes, there are multiple versions due to the various time resets and adaptations that we've been presented with. But Jonah typically was trapped inside a space whale, and surviving inside that environment linked him to the ultra energies that allowed the creature to survive in space. Yep, Jonah and the whale. But as a result of this interaction, he gained all the powers of Superman, but his body could only have one active at any point. As with many classic Legionnaires, he was first introduced in Superboy's book. His deal was that he had traveled to the past with his mentor as part of his initiation ritual for the Legion. At the time, he was only shown to have his vision powers. The rest would show up with later appearances. I mentioned his powers were stronger than Superboy's. The obvious example is his Penetra vision, which can see through lead, unlike Mon-El or Superboy's X-ray vision that cannot see through such dense materials. In the early days of the Legion, you needed a unique power to join the team, so he was only allowed on the team because of that specific ability, which is just so weird. Anyway, his other powers are likewise rumored to be greater than Superboy's, but he lacks the secondary superpowers to use them to their fullest. For example, he can't move at his top speed without ripping up his body because when using super speed, he's not invulnerable. For most versions, he's romantically linked with Phantom Girl / Apparition, although we've seen him temporarily linked with other characters like Shadowlass during the 3-boot era. As far as personality, Ultra Boy's a little rougher than the clean-cut Superboy. He's often drawn and written like Harrison Ford as Han Solo, in my opinion, due to having a connection to crime in his youth. In many versions, the green icon he wears was the symbol of his gang, or his underworld alias, the Green Dragon. But like Han Solo, that heroism always shines through. And actually, Phantom Girl is a bit of an aristocrat, so very Princess Leia. And one thing I want to call out is that while Jonah is often depicted as a bit of a meathead, he's actually quite cunning. During the 5-year gap, he became aware of time manipulations that the team was being subjected to by Gloranthe, and chose to play dumb to prevent Gloranthe from realizing that he had become aware of the plan, and instead feigned accidents that would foil her manipulations. It's a version of being street smart as opposed to the scientific or strategic geniuses that we normally see. Now that said, the Brian Michael Bendis version of the Legion of Superheroes shows us an Ultra Boy who's a bit more upper crust and rules oriented, but we're still in the early days of that version. The classic Ultra Boy outfit has a very garish base design to it, but I've always been a fan of the more modern iterations. His 90s one in particular is one of my favorites, as evidenced by the lead image I chose for this video. But some of the others, not so much. Ultra Boy's powers are a fascinating mental exercise for me. Any of these powers would be amazing to have, but you have to wonder how you'd make it all work. Good thing he has a Legion flight ring, so he can always fly plus do whatever. Although stories where he's stripped of it are really interesting, like in the excellent original Legion Lost comic. And hey, we talked about that on Men of Steel. With his raw power, classic presence, interesting shtick, and hotshot attitude, he makes it into most Legion adaptations. It's amazing what a small limitation can do to inspire story ideas and establish stakes. So while he's not the heaviest hitter on a team with so many heavy hitters, Ultra Boy is a fun hero with every power you need to have a high fantasy story, but not encumbered by having all of them all of the time. Next time, we're going to talk about a character who's really only more hinted at than actually seen in action. But considering her pedigree, she's definitely worth discussing here. But until then, stay super, man.
Yeah, so that's Ultra Boy. He's a character I really like as a concept, and I think has a lot of legs. And he's fine. He's just in a big team book that where he doesn't get a chance to shine quite as much as he could. And he certainly has had some stories that have really shown. I do really like his 5 years later story, both the story of him dealing with the death of his wife and the great conspiracy story that plays out. I think it really reframes Ultra Boy as a much more cunning kind of character, and I actually dig that interpretation of him. Moving on, this is a character who is Legion adjacent, but there's just not a lot of information on her, but it's an interesting one to bring up because this is the hypothetical daughter of Supergirl and Brainiac 5 from the Kingdom Come book. So like I said, Legion adjacent because she's featured as she's the daughter of Brainiac 5, but she's part of the Kingdom Come story, and we see her. One interesting note about this character is that she is clearly wearing the design that Alex Ross has always wanted to put Supergirl in, because it's this giant S that he used the exact same design, just with a different color scheme in Supreme for Suprema. Like, yeah, it's a huge S, like filling up the whole body. And it's like it's very much Alex Ross art. But here's the video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And for this week's Superman Analogue, I want to talk about a character who mostly appeared in the background and really only in one major story, and that's Brainiac's daughter from Kingdom Come. One thing I always loved about the Legion of Superheroes, and I think most fans of the Legion will back me up here, is that the passage of time changed alliances, and ultimately we were looking at a better world. Because when you look at the 20th century, one of Superman's arch rivals was Brainiac. But then you get to the 30th century, and you have Brainiac 5, Brainiac's descendant, be it from robotic iterations, cloning, adoption, or just the old-fashioned way, a hero in good standing in the Legion of Superheroes, and often someone who ends up romantically involved with Supergirl when he wasn't with Laurel Gand. It's like how in Star Trek The Next Generation, we have Worf. The former villains have become allies and heroes as we progress into a better world. So when Mark Waid and Alex Ross were creating Kingdom Come, they had to fill out lots of characters in the background. It's supposed to be a world that's just overpopulated with superpowered beings. So there's all kinds of one-off ideas just thrown out there to show the drift of comics over time. And one of those background characters is a nod to the Brainiac-Supergirl relationship. In the notes, they call her Brainiac's daughter, with the real identity of XTC, which is a music reference. XTC was an English rock band, and they had a song called Brainiac's Daughter, so it was a fun allusion. The character has a lot of the classic Alex Ross design flares, what with the main icon being enlarged so it becomes a huge design element for the character. We see this all over Kingdom Come, but we also see this in characters like Supreme when Alex Ross attempted to redesign his outfit. But aside from her background appearances in Kingdom Come, that's kind of it. We did get a blink and you'll miss it appearance in Justice League Adventures number 20, which I have to thank user Kara Quirrell for pointing out to me, but that was an incredibly quick cameo. So while I have her in my headcanon as Brainiac 6, we honestly just don't know that much about this character. We know that she can fly and that she's super strong, but we don't even really have a gauge for how much, and that's about it. So while she's a really cool to think about character, we don't really know that much more. That said, a Kryptonian-Coluan hybrid is dope, and I'd love to see her again in something. There's been a lot of attention given to the House of El and how the lineage of Superman eventually would go on to intermarry with fifth-dimensional imps and have members who become Blue Lanterns, but I like the idea that Supergirl has her own distinct lineage, and that from her side, one of Superman's worst enemies will eventually become the forebear of the next generation of Kryptonian superheroes. Anyway, next time, instead of talking about a hypothetical daughter of Supergirl, let's talk about a character who kind of stood in for her towards the later part of the reboot era of the Legion of Superheroes. But until then, stay super, man.
Man, it's fun to think about when I was doing these threads because I had such an active community that I was like engaging with about it. So there were like fans of Kara Zor-El or who like referenced XTC and like enjoyed that I brought her up as a character. So fun, just a fun thing that Twitter used to be and no longer is. And even Blue Sky hasn't really replaced that. It's a bummer because Twitter had really become like a great place to go and just enjoy comics. And that's gone now. So we move on, and we are continuing our Legion stuff. This is a segue into some more Shazam stuff. And so we're talking about CC Beck, aka Thunder, the Shazam of the future.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And what is this? Another blonde who can take on a fleet of warships by herself? In the Legion of Superheroes? No. Yeah. Let's see what the power of Shazam looks like in the future. Today, my Superman analog is Thunder. Thunder was originally created for the Legends of Dead Earth event in the 90s, a collection of annuals that all took place far in the future, with the descendants of Earth remembering the legends of the 20th century. Thunder was a girl of that time, the latest avatar of Shazam. Her human form was CC Beck, a nod to the Captain Marvel artist of the 1940s, while being from Binderon, a nod to Otto Binder, famed Captain Marvel writer as well as creator of both Mary Marvel and Supergirl. As part of an attack on her world by the Three Faces of Evil, she was accidentally transported to the Rock of Eternity. There, she encountered Captain Marvel, now ravaged by time, who bestowed upon her his own powers, just as Shazam had done for him. As a result, she would say Captain Marvel to transform into her powered form. After an adventure in the 20th century, helping out the young version of her mentor, she would get lost in time before settling in the far distant past of the 30th century. This was during the post-Zero Hour reboot era of the Legion of Superheroes, where she would go on to join the team. Now, I read her initial origin story and some of her adventures with the Legion, but I don't have that much to say about her tenure with the team. My three big takeaways were that 1, she quickly established herself as a match for Mon-El, allowing her to fill the void that Andromeda left. The two became sort of a shock troop duo. 2, she became fast friends with Censor, allowing for quieter scenes. And 3, once the Rock of Eternity was restored, she was able to actually go back and forth from her own time, mirroring the relationship of Kara Zor-El with the Legion, although in this scenario, she was going into the future. However, I love that she serves as a Supergirl stand-in that they tied into Captain Marvel. I think it was a really elegant solution, utilizing one of my favorite properties. Captain Marvel and his related characters are some of my favorite, and I love them getting representation in one of my favorite teams. Sadly, Thunder didn't make it onto the 3-boot era, what with Supergirl actually being on the team, and we did get some glimpses of her during the Legion of Three Worlds event. But it's fun to reflect on an era where CC Beck was their maid of might. As for design, her look is a nice adaptation of the classic Captain Marvel look. Rather than the puffier military style of the 20th century Power of Shazam family members, she has a sleek bodysuit befitting a dancer build and consistent with the reboot era Legion outfits. And her slipper design resembles the Bronze Age appearance of Mary Marvel. And I love the Legion accessories that were added on later. Her powers are your standard God-given wisdom, strength, stamina, power, courage, and speed that her family of heroes all have, so she definitely is in the same weight class as Supergirl. Next time, I want to stick with a wielder of the power of Shazam, so I'll be moving on from the Legion for the time being. But this is by no means the last time I'll be talking about the Legion on here. Obviously, I have to come back and talk about Kent Shakespeare at some point, but next time I want to talk about the girl who started the trend of distaff counterparts to their world's mightiest mortals. But until then, stay super, man.
She's an underutilized character in Legion. I'll say that. I have a lot of fun ideas about how she could have been a much bigger player in the Legion of Superheroes and not been, like a weird anomaly that could have been very interesting, but they didn't go with it. And then, it was a limited use character that they could have had some more fun with if they really thought about it. I will say that. And with that, we move on to Mary Marvel. And this was a really fun one for me to do. These are all fun. I keep saying that's fun. But going back to the Shazam family I always really enjoy going into those characters and looking especially at the Golden Age material. And there's a lot of Golden Age material for Mary Marvel. So check out this video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, I mentioned last time that there are still plenty of Legionnaires who meet the criteria for Superman Analog, but I'm going to use last week's example of Thunder to pivot to other Girls of Steel, and I might as well start with the OG, Mary Marvel. Mary Marvel is the younger sister of Captain Marvel. Shazam, with the exact same powers, though in some continuities, she drew them from a different sextet of gods, in her case Selene, Hippolyta, Ariadne, Zephyr, Aurora, and Minerva. And I call her the OG because she predates Supergirl by about a decade, and Otto Binder, her creator, also was tasked with creating Supergirl years later when he worked for DC. Classically, while Billy was never adopted and thus forced to live on the streets, Mary was adopted to a suburban family, the Bromfelds, which is why they have different last names. As with Superman versus Captain Marvel, her powers are comparable to Supergirl, assuming both are at their prime. And I've alluded to her being at full power or at her prime a couple of times now, so I might as well mention that back in the 90s, all of the main characters from the power of Shazam shared a common pool of power. So if all three were activated in their powered forms, it would be divided into a weaker version than if only one was marvelous at the time. I don't think this is currently in effect, and it was not in effect in the Golden Age. But since the power of Shazam is a series I hold dearly, I would not feel comfortable without at least alluding to that aspect of it. Anyway, since the original run of the Fawcett comics, Mary has been a mainstay of the Shazam books. As common with female characters, her fashion has molded with the time. For example, I just discovered this version of her dressed as a cowgirl, and I adore it. And when you look at the 70s, she had a lighter weight design with flats. Meanwhile, personally, I'm a big fan of her 90s white outfit. It made her visually distinct from the other Marvels, in a time when it was just the Big Red Cheese and Junior. Or I guess in that era, it was CM3. And then there were the various black costumes when she went bad. But those were not good stories, and I'll leave it at that. Actually, I take that back, I won't. You should check out Linkara's Atop the Fourth Wall series for a long-form breakdown on why the story was bad, specifically talking about Countdown to Final Crisis. Anyway, she's made appearances of late in the New 52 era, and since then in the Rebirth era and beyond. In fact, she's now going to be headlining the latest Shazam book, though nowadays I believe she's being presented as Billy's adopted sister rather than biological sister. Her style has likewise been made to look more mystical in form, though keeping certain design elements. At the moment, although I'm sure that's to change with the upcoming series, Mary doesn't have as many solo adventures under her belt as some of the other Marvels, but she is certainly a powerhouse. She's taken down some of the most powerful characters in the DCU in single combat. And as with most Marvels, she's pretty much unstoppable in her fully powered form. It's only when she reverts to being a human girl that she's vulnerable. And even in her human form, we've seen versions where she's been able to tap into some of the powers of Shazam without fully giving in. At the time, it's no secret that I love all things Shazam. And Mary is a great part of that franchise, and as I noted, she's one of the ranking female heavy hitters in comics. While her brothers and allies sometimes get more spotlight, Mary Marvel is the prototype that all distaff counterparts of these big male flying brick heroes have followed. She's smart, capable, and usually more responsible than her brother. To the readers, she's the big sister we always wanted. Now, next time I'm going to talk about a different Marvel, and that's because I'm bad at algorithms. So as the MCU Miss Marvel series is coming to a close, I should probably talk about the history of the character of Miss Marvel. And since I already talked about Carol Danvers, the original Miss Marvel, I should probably move on to number 2. But until then, stay super, man.
Man, looking at that video, I remember how excited I was for the Mary Marvel focused Shazam series. And it is a shame that that one ran, I think it only ran like 6 issues. It may have run a full 12, but it felt short and then was rebooted into the Mark Waid Shazam series. Again, the consistent tone for Shazam characters is, generally speaking, that their book has probably been canceled, but their fans are clamoring for a new one, and then a new one comes out, and there isn't enough support to keep it going for very, very long, which is just an unfortunate part about being a Captain Marvel fan. So yeah, that was the Mary Marvel video. I really liked that one. I was very happy with it. Again, happy with all these, but that video came out really well. I was pleased with the nature of it. Next up is talking about Miss Marvel 2, aka She-Thing, aka Sharon Ventura, who is a fun character from Marvel Comics that probably is better known for outfits being selectable in various video games as opposed to the actual character. But yeah, let's check out the video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, a lot of people are being introduced to Kamala Khan, Miss Marvel, over on Disney Plus right now, but not everyone knows that she is in fact the 4th major character at Marvel Comics to bear that name. And since I've already talked about the original Miss Marvel, Carol Danvers, let's talk about some of the others. As far as I know, there have been 4 Miss Marvels to date. One easily fits the bill for my purposes as Superman Analogue, one I've already covered, one probably doesn't, but I'm still gonna cover her anyway, and one probably works at least for a time. That last one is Sharon Ventura. Sharon Ventura was a military dropout turned pro wrestler who was given superpowers in order to make the matches better and secretly evil. But she avoided being turned into a villain by the Power Broker, who was orchestrating the whole scheme. Now that name should probably ring a bell to people who've been following the Disney Plus MCU shows. Yep, this is tied into US Agent. Loosely. These female superpowered wrestlers were known as the Grapplers. Now, while some of them had less conventional powers, like Screaming Mimi, who some people may know better as the reformed hero Songbird, Sharon Ventura had the meat and potatoes powers of super strength and durability. In this regard, she's the least powerful character actually to bear the name Miss Marvel. She became romantically linked with the Thing and associated with the Fantastic Four. Obviously, this was tough given the whole him being a rock monster thing, and also she wasn't really into it at first, but he was persistent because, you know, woman as prize. However, eventually she and the Thing had an encounter with cosmic rays that further mutated him and turned her into a rock monster like him. On the plus side, this made their romance easier to bloom, but also didn't go over very well for her. She was pretty upset for very obvious reasons. At this point, she became known as She-Thing, which included a power upgrade. She joined the Fantastic Four for a time, but was also easily manipulated by villains like Dr. Doom, who pledged to cure her. It's this period where I first discovered her, when she briefly joined a version of the Wizard's Frightful Four. Nowadays, she's retired and human, I think. Her legacy largely forgotten except when people deep dive into Fantastic Four material, specifically related to the Thing. Oh, fun story. In the future timeline of the Fantastic Five, she and Ben had 2 kids, a boy like the Thing and a girl with powers more like the Human Torches. And I'm a big fan of the MC2 stuff and was happy that she was a part of that run. Outside of that, she doesn't really show up a ton. I think she's been in the background for some crossovers, such as A Prisoner During Civil War, and her outfit is often an alt costume for Carol Danvers in games like Marvel Ultimate Alliance, because as costumes go, it's actually pretty good. It pays homage to Carol's original design, and I like the stylized M that's part of the design, which would carry over to her She-Thing design. She looks like a big primary color hero lady, like Marvels are supposed to. I do wish I knew a bit more about Sharon Ventura, but in the meantime, let's just bask in the glow of one of the various predecessors to what has become an incredibly popular Marvel superhero. Next time, we'll be talking about a villain who bore the Miss Marvel name for evil. But until then, stay super, man.
So yeah, that's Sharon Ventura. She's fun. I say that a lot. I'm really catching that as a verbal tick of mine in these recaps, and that's kind of driving me insane. Also, a thing that I'm catching myself using a lot in these videos is I'm saying full stop, which is just an observation that happens when you're just talking to yourself about a video series that you made several years ago. Anyway, moving on, we are moving on to Moonstone. And this is one of my favorite characters in comics. She is so goddamn cool. I was such a huge fan of the Thunderbolts run from the 90s, and just happy to have her around always. So yeah, check out the video.
Hey everyone, I'm Kay Sagan, and you all know what we're doing today. For this week's Superman Analogue, we're moving on from Sharon Ventura to Karla Sofen. The 3rd Miss Marvel had a much longer history in the MCU and bore several identities. Much of it's tied up in one of my favorite books of all time, Thunderbolts. Today, we are talking about Karla Sofen, but she is best known as Moonstone. And I should note that she's actually Moonstone 2, but the first one was a minor villain who never really mastered his powers. He basically was just a punk who lucked into an alien artifact that gave him amazing powers. Powers that Carla Sofen wanted. You see, before she was a supervillain, she was Dr. Carla Sofen, a psychiatrist tasked with treating tormented villains. When she was introduced to Moonstone, she saw that he was an opportunity for her to gain power. So rather than treating her patient, she instead manipulated him into giving up the titular Moonstone, which he had bonded to, and then she claimed it for herself. Now, that theme of manipulation will color nearly all of her future appearances. Okay, so before we go further, let's talk about the actual powers she got, because when I was a kid, this was the character whose powers I used to dream about having. After Captain Marvel, of course. The Shazam one, I guess I should clarify. So Moonstone started out as a Hulk villain, so people tend to forget that she's pretty buff. In fact, she's able to lift airliners and tank explosions. Plus, she can fly, she can manipulate energy, and she can phase through solid matter. I remember in one issue of Thunderbolts, there was a plane that was going down, and she was asked if she was strong enough to catch it. She pointed out that she was, but the plane wasn't, so she had to provide thrust to guide it down instead. After she set off as a supervillain, she became linked with the Masters of Evil, Baron Zemo's team, and took part in the Avengers Under Siege story, one of the all-time best Avengers stories. During that, she tangled with Monica Rambeau, Captain Marvel, and was thoroughly outclassed by the energy-based hero. Now, this set her to work with Zemo when he launched the Thunderbolts scheme in the wake of most of the Marvel superheroes apparently dying in battle against the mutant onslaught, although in fact they were actually shunted away into a pocket dimension. On this team of heavy hitters, she was the powerhouse. And that's really saying something, because also on this team was Atlas, who was Power Man before Luke Cage and had the same abilities as Wonder Man, plus Ant-Man/Giant Man growing powers, kinda, and I still feel comfortable saying that Sofen was the heavy hitter on the team. Anyway, the idea was a bunch of villains took on heroic identities as a con. Great book, great idea, a little annoyed that it was less elegantly reused later for Dark Avengers, but whatever. During this time, Sofen took on the identity of Meteorite and restricted her powers to throw people off. And as I said before, this is how I first knew her. She constantly vied for control of the team, fostering her teammates' enjoyment of the heroic role to sway them to rebel against Zemo. She assumed the role of de facto leader for a time, but remained the selfish villain in the group. As with the rest of the team, she struggled with her self-identity, especially when Hawkeye joined the team and became leader. She began a relationship with him in order to manipulate him, but had his altruism rub off on her a little, and it didn't really last. The team eventually traveled to the Counter-Earth from Heroes Reborn, where she encountered that world's version of Moonstone 1. Sofen did what Sofen does and took his Moonstone, exponentially increasing her powers for a time until both Moonstones were taken from her by a now benign Baron Zemo. She was comatose for a while, but woke up, joined the new Suicide Squad-esque version of the Thunderbolts that had risen up during this time, and eventually became the base for Norman Osborn's Dark Avengers, where this time she took on the role of Miss Marvel, and sued poor Ultragirl to make her stop wearing the OG costume. And this makes sense. Carol Danvers was rising in prominence, just about to become Captain Marvel. They both were similar-looking blonde women with Dragon Ball Z powers. But more importantly, they shared a Kree connection. It turned out that the Moonstone was an ancient weapon used by ancient Kree superheroes. The helmet she wore in her first design always looked like a Kree helmet, and this explained why. Since then, I understand there was a Dark Avengers 2, Electric Boogaloo, where she pulled the same stunt, this time as Captain Marvel, and good luck with that. But the point I want to emphasize is that Dr. Carla Sofen is manipulative and only out for herself, but can be swayed to do the right thing. She rarely plays the role of hero with any sincerity, but when she does, she makes an excellent Superman analog. Next time, we're going to finish up our retrospective on the various Miss Marvels. But until then, stay super, man.
So that was a fun character to revisit. I just really adore Carla Sofen as just a manipulative sociopath. No, just wonderful character. Anyway, moving on to Ms. Marvel, Kamala Khan. This is, of course, another one where the movie hadn't come out yet at the time of this video being released. So I can't talk about the Marvels but you know, it was a perfectly good series, and it's a good character that I like, and who doesn't really fit the mold for what we're talking about in the series really that well. But you know, she's got weird powers that are fun, and you know, she's a heavy enough hitter that it's admitted to be a stretch of a video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And alright, yep, we all know what we're here for today. For this week's Superman Analog, we're going to talk about the most recent Miss Marvel, Kamala Khan. Now, at the start of this series, I said that she probably doesn't fit that well into the archetype of Superman Analog, and I mostly stand by that, although we will talk about how that might be changing in at least some media soon. But I do want to be clear that Kamala Khan is dope. Like, she's one of the breakout hits of the modern era of Marvel Comics. However, I should note that because I am not super caught up on books from the last couple of years, most of my exposure to her is from the initial trades, her more recent series, and Champions. So I don't think it's a particularly hot take that Kamala doesn't exactly fit what most people think of when they think of a Superman type, despite being in a primary color red and blue costume with yellow accents. Normally her powers are represented more like Plastic Man's. She's a shapeshifter. And while the Miss Marvel name has always fit the character just fine, and I will get into that in a second, it should be noted that her role on the team is usually not as a heavy hitter, or even as a D&D style leader, but rather a contemplating battlefield controller. So for example, on the Champions, there are plenty of strikers and defenders. So for Kamala, she's the one that thinks through problems and handles them strategically, like a Peter Parker or a Reed Richards. Her powers let her move about and manipulate the battlefield. I mean, she's strong and she's tough, but she's not the point person for a mission. She's mission control. But Kamala Khan is a great Miss Marvel. A consistent aspect of the Miss Marvel persona has been that they have been a human given powers, at least before they get retconned into always being aliens. And in the case of Carol and Carla before her, they were tied to the Kree. And at least traditionally, Kamala has been tied to the Kree as well. You see, she's an Inhuman, a subrace of humans that were altered by the Kree to have the potential to gain superpowers. So much like the White event in New Universe and the Big Bang incident in Milestone Comics, Marvel had an event called the Terrigen bomb explosion, which was a catalyst for lots of people gaining superpowers. And Kamala Khan got sucked up in that, just like so many others, leaving her a stretchy superhero. But at her core, she's a teenage girl who writes fan fiction and idolizes heroes like Carol Danvers. She's very real. And that's exactly what Marvel Comics are about. Her design is a great nod to both the original Miss Marvel costume and Carol's second look with the stylized lightning bolt / S design, while also accounting for both modern styles and modesty that you'd expect a teenage girl with very strict parents to live with. And due to the distinct nature of her powers, she really stands out in a crowd scene. Being a breakout character, she's been part of the Avengers, the Champions. We've seen future versions of her on teams like the Exiles. She's made appearances on cartoons and been the main viewpoint character in video games. And her relationship with Carol Danvers has strengthened over time. The character is very much intended to be a modern teen dealing with real problems, in the great tradition of characters like Spider-Man before her, and as a result has been used as a jumping off point to explore broader concepts of how modernity affects superheroism. Due to an incident when she was with the Champions, in the universe of Marvel Comics, a law was passed called the Underage Superhuman Welfare Act, aka Kamala's Law, which forbade young people from engaging in superheroic activities. As a result, even in universe, she has become the face of the next generation of heroes in Marvel Comics. Meanwhile, we just got her series on Disney+. And, well, let's just say the Inhuman connection has been downplayed a bit. Now, instead of being the descendant of experiments done by the alien race, the Kree, she might be a mutant, or she might be the descendant of a genie. And I have to admit, I honestly didn't expect them to ever bring out the clandestine in the MCU. So along with her origins now no longer being a result of the Terrigen Mist, it now seems to function in a different way as well, although the actual practical effects are pretty similar, in that she's able to create energy-filled constructs that emulate a larger physique rather than simply growing in size or changing her shape. Clearly, this is all part of an effort to make her more connected to Captain Marvel, with things like the Noor dimension possibly being a version of the Negative Zone. And honestly, with her updated powers, allowing her now to shield herself with force fields and simulate flight by walking through air, she's starting to look more like a Superman analog than she used to. But this is a character at a turning point, and with more appearances we will find out what the shape of the character will look like, whether it be embiggened or energized, in the future of the MCU. For now, I'm very excited about the state of the character, and intrigued to see what they can do with an average teen given powers and abilities far beyond those of mortal men. Anyway, that's it for my Miss Marvel talk. Next time we'll be talking about a much more obvious Superman analog, but until then, stay super, man.
Oh, the other thing I didn't talk about with Kamala Khan in this video, because it hadn't happened yet in the real world, was that since the time of this video, she's become a mutant in Marvel Comics. And so she's gone through the Krakoa resurrection process. And so there's been a whole redefinition of her as part of the mutant community. And so that is a change for the character, and just part of making these videos at the moment in time when I make the video. So we move on to another character that is kind of locked to the limited appearances of the run that she comes from, and that's Suprema. She comes from the Alan Moore run of Supreme. There have been limited appearances of her in other media since that run, connected mostly with Rob Liefeld stuff, but it is not the majority is her in the Alan Moore run of Supreme. And so this is another character video, much like the Mary Marvel video was a chance for me to redo my love of Captain Marvel. This was a chance for me to redo my love for the Alan Moore run of Supreme. And yeah, this is a really fun video as a result. I keep saying that word. I know I can't stop it. I'm sorry. But yeah, I love talking about this particular run of the book, and Suprema is a fun character that is part of that run, which I really like. So there.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. And while I'm discussing awesome female Superman analogs, I should probably talk about Suprema from Alan Moore's Supreme run. His nod to the Silver Age Supergirl in a very retro-inspired book. Suprema was introduced during the Supreme Story of the Year arc that launched the revamped book after Moore took over. She was an adopted sister named Sally to Supreme's alter ego of Ethan Crane. After an encounter with the time-lost Supremium Man, a fascinating nod to the Kryptonite Man that I don't want to spoil here, she was left with powers just like her brother. She had adventures throughout the decades until she was trapped in space by Gor-El, the Living Galaxy, a cosmic being that Supreme had to free her from. As with Supreme, she took part in adventures with the time-traveling League of Infinity, a reference to the Legion of Superheroes. When she was freed in the 1990s by Supreme, she went right back to her career as a hero. She eventually joined Youngblood, which was restructured as a Teen Titans-style youth-centric team, as their resident powerhouse. When she first showed up, Suprema was designed to emulate the Silver Age Supergirl with a very simple dress design. Once she became a part of Youngblood, she was updated to have a more dynamic, regal-looking outfit. And then there's some of the art that you'll see for covers of reprints that use an Alex Ross design that she never actually wore in the books. And if you look at it, it's actually a palette swap of the Brainiac's daughter design. Suprema was always noted for having trouble adapting to modern society. She clung to her Silver Age style, even as other time-lost friends like the female Robin analog, Twilight, changed with the times. This caused friction with the team, but they came to respect each other's positions, even as they would poke fun at her, calling her the Flying Nun. Sadly, the awesome line didn't last long. Alan Moore had a lot of scripts finished that never came out, so we have an idea of where the characters would have gone, but those plans were realigned as the characters were folded back into Rob Liefeld's domain. And that's it for the big Suprema stories that I know about. She cameoed in the attempted relaunch of Supreme in the late aughts, and apparently had a mini-series around that time with a somewhat questionable redesign by Rob Liefeld that I missed somehow. Suprema had the chance to be a big player if that run of Youngblood had taken off. As it is, she's a character close to my heart and a great example of what a Supergirl-type character can be. However, next time, we're going to talk about a distaff counterpart to a Superman analog that got a bit more twisted. Until then, stay super, man.
I have to admit, with some hindsight, that the Alan Moore run of Supreme has started to show its age. It's not as cutting edge as it was when it first came out, and that means that a lot of the story ideas that were novel at the time have been done to death, such as multiversal counterparts of your main character. That's just a thing about the passage of time and stuff. But I still really like Suprema, and I really like this video on her. So I'm very glad that I had a chance to make this. Moving on to Strontian, which is just more proof that the series is me doing series that I really dig because I really enjoyed the Abnett and Lanning Nova run. And that's my main exposure to the character. And so I'm basically talking about that one story plus like a little bit of background details on her because that is a really cool version of her. So check out the video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Sagan. Now, there are a lot of Superman analogs, and for a lot of those Superman analogs, they have distaff counterparts to correspond to Supergirl. And while last time I talked about a character who shared Supergirl's better qualities, this time let's talk about one who's a bit more villainous. Gladiator's cousin, Zenith, aka the Strontian. So, Strontian is pretty mean. While Gladiator may be more lawful than good on the spectrum, he's still a good guy. But Strontian is absolutely brutal. While she's a 1-to-1 Supergirl match to Gladiator's Superman, her personality is about being ruthless in the name of maintaining her own authority. In her backstory, she went through the same Gladiator process to supercharge her powers just like Kalark. So we're talking about full-on, borderline Silver Age Superman levels. As a result, she's one of the most powerful beings in the Marvel Comics universe, just before you get to the cosmic types like Silver Surfer. At some point in her backstory, she went too far in her service of the Shi'ar Empire and was imprisoned. However, Zenith is still a Strontian, and their entire species has pledged an oath to the Shi'ar Empire. So when Vulcan, the Omega-level mutant brother of Cyclops and Havoc, took over the Shi'ar Empire, he freed her and made her one of his personal guard, the Praetorian, and then he unleashed her on the world. Now, while she makes for a fearsome enforcer, she does share some of the weaknesses of Gladiator, so there are creative ways to beat her. Certain radiation and magic are options, but since most of their abilities are psychic, Strontians are actually vulnerable to things that negate psionic abilities, as seen here in this badass scene from Nova. My understanding is that she is currently a prisoner of the Nova Corps for war crimes that she committed, and that's probably a good thing, because a villainous Superman analog can be one of the greatest threats that a hero has to face, and one of the most satisfying to overcome. Strontian certainly fits that bill. The heroes of Marvel are just lucky that the rest of her family aren't quite so evil. But hey, thinking about the DNA run on Nova makes me think about another cousin of a Superman analog that we should probably talk about. So next time, we'll be talking about Namora. But until then, stay super, man.
See, that's part of the element of this series that is kind of like an oral history. I happen to tell the story that I happen to know about these characters. And so this is the thing that is really cool about Strontian, that the story that came from her appearance in Nova during the War of Kings arc from Abnett and Lanning, doing the space stuff for Marvel at the time. So yeah, that's Strontian. Next up, we move on to a character that had such a cool reinvention in the late 2000s, early 2010s, and that is Namora. She is so cool and completely replaced her daughter in the pop culture of Marvel when she became known. And since this video got to be a character in the Black Panther sequel, which I got a chance to rewatch recently, and I have to say the Ironheart subplot is an extra, and if that was taken out, would probably speed up the movie a bit in good ways. But I really like the Atlantis stuff in there, and there's a version of Namora in that. So anyway, yeah, check out the video.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Sagan, and I gotta tell you, there are distaff counterparts of Superman analog characters all over. And Namor, the Submariner, has two. So let's start with the first one, his cousin Namora. Namora goes back to the Golden Age. She has the same basic setup as Namor, a child of both land and sea, and is nominally his cousin, though I recall an adoption was involved there, so it's not by blood. Also, I should note that given how linear time works, as with a lot of the things that you could say Namor shares with Superman, like being a flying brick, for example, it actually starts with Namor first, so in this case, the cousin as distaff counterpart begins here, and then is replicated by Kara Zor-El. But anyway, after being a regular part of Marvel continuity, or Timely, or Atlas, or whatever, during the 40s, she didn't have much of a presence once Namor was revived in the Silver Age. She had some appearances, but was killed, big air quotes there, after a while. But we are talking about Marvel Comics after all, so she was brought back in the 2000s to be a part of Agents of Atlas, a very fun book dealing with the fantastical underworld of the Marvel U, while starring a cast of mostly forgotten characters from the 50s. You know, back when the comic company was called Atlas. When Namora was brought back, it was made clear that she was the powerhouse of the team. She has the same mighty abilities as her cousin, so she can take on most of the heaviest hitters in Marvel, like the Hulk or Ares. I was a big fan of her relationship with Hercules. Both were strong, consenting adults with distinct personalities. Sadly, it was not to be, but they both walked away with good memories from the tryst. I would definitely recommend to anyone interested to look at Agents of Atlas. It's a great book. And while Namora has been around since then, I'm not actually sure if she's appearing in anything regularly these days. Oh, since I am a vocal fan of the Exiles comics, I should note that a blue-skinned version of Namora appeared in that book. She had been the ruler of her world, having slain all the heroes in a semi-justified war before joining up with the team. As with the 616 version, she was a massive powerhouse. When the team battled Hyperion, she actually broke his neck. Sadly, his healing factor allowed him to bounce back, and his radioactive vision was able to incinerate her, so her tenure wasn't that long on the team. Also, I should note that the Exiles version is more of a female version of Namor rather than an alternate reality Namora, but whatever. Back to the 616 version, her costume is a functional bathing suit. It's nice that it's not exactly Namor's gender flipped, but also has nods to his really cool black outfit. While Namora has more recently come back into prominence, she was missing for the Bronze Age and the 90s. This is because her role was filled by her daughter, in big air quotes, actually a clone, Namorita, who I will discuss next time. But for now, let's just bask in the awesomeness that is the strong, fierce woman who beds gods and wars against dragon crime lords while brokering peace treaties with invaders from other realities. She might be a better Superman analog than her cousin, frankly. So like I said, next time we'll be talking about Namorita, but until then, stay super, man.
These are two characters that I really dig. Namora, I think, is just a very cool, badass, like, woman character. And then Namorita, I never realized that I was saying Namor and not Namor, and that it was different until a commenter pointed it out, and then I went back and checked all the different versions of how it was said, and then the Black Panther 2 movie said Namor or Namor, and it just completely broke my brain in terms of how I'm supposed to say this. Anyway, Namorita is really cool, and was one of the first times that I really recognized the analogous nature of Namor with Superman, and by way of each of them having this young blonde cousin that is, a big powerhouse on the teen scene of things. So check out this video on a really fun character. I keep saying that word.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, as promised, I'm talking today about Namorita, who is arguably a more direct Supergirl parallel to Namor the Submariner's Superman analog than her mother, Namora. Now, I'm using air quotes around the word mother because Namorita is actually a clone of Namora, though I think she was in vitro and carried to term, so it's accurate enough. Anyway, Namorita tends to appear more as a teen, despite her long lifespan actually placing her at half a century old. And Namorita, or Nita to her friends, belongs on this list. As the clone of Namora, who we've established can go a few rounds with the Hulk, Namorita is no slouch. Seriously, she is on the high end of Marvel characters that I'm going to talk about in this series, though not at the top like a Hyperion or a Thor. And with her winged feet and limited psychic powers, she can fly just like Namor. She's extremely durable, plus she can imitate the powers of marine creatures far better than either her mother or cousin. If her mom's the Wonder Woman of the waves, this is the Supergirl of the seas. However, probably her greatest impact on Marvel was being a founding member of the New Warriors, a book that I really want to revisit. This was Marvel's teen team of the 90s, and many of those characters have gone on to be big players, and a shocking number of members are going to be discussed in this series. And of course, the New Warriors, with Namorita in tow, oh, she became blue by the way, but I'll get to that, were the catalyst to the Civil War arc, which most people know as a pretty good movie, but before that was a subpar crossover event. Namorita was at ground zero fighting the exploding villain Nitro, and was among the casualties of the Stamford incident, where massive collateral damage kicked off the Superhuman Registration Act. But before that, she had a long career, appearing in solo and team stories. Her classic look was a green one-piece bathing suit, which matched the classic Namor green Speedo. However, she wore a variety of outfits over the years. Some were trendy pieces, others were fan service, but towards the end, she had her Atlantean side of her hybrid nature accentuated, making her skin turn blue. See, I told you I'd get there. During this period, she was called the Chimera, but it was spelled weird. You see, in the cloning process, they spliced in DNA from pure-blooded Atlanteans into Namora's genome in an effort to stabilize it. Then, later in life, when exposed to high levels of stress, this caused those characteristics to manifest on Namorita. During her time in the spotlight, Namorita often acted as a moral compass to her cousin. She was more engaged in the surface world, and would prompt him to likewise attempt to be more of a hero. While she could be a snob, she had nowhere near the arrogance that he displayed. She had a comfortable spot in the MCU as a powerhouse on a then popular team with ties to the earliest characters ever published in the line. It was only as the New Warriors were eclipsed by newer properties that she lost prominence. I should also note that she's technically alive. Namorita was plucked from the past in one of the last Nova stories that Abnett and Lanning did, and we never saw her go back, so she might actually be still out there. And I wouldn't mind seeing her reappear. I always enjoyed the character. I mean, I like aquatic characters in general, and love books that load up on flying bricks. I mean, this is what I do this video series about. Namora might be the original, but her daughter definitely deserves her own place in the Marvel Universe. But it's probably time that I talk about some of the more famous Girls of Steel. So next time, we'll be talking about Supergirl. But until then, stay super, man.
All right, and this is a great segue here because now we are going to have a really exciting time talking about the various Supergirls. And I had been holding off on doing this for a little while because I knew I wanted to do a bunch of them in a row and have a really good time talking about it. And I knew I wanted to start with the one that is the big trivia note because it's so exciting and I'm trying not to say fun. It's fun to do ones that are one-off stories because then I don't have to worry about being like comprehensive or feeling like whatever I say is going to be invalidated because of a new story that comes out a few years after I initially wrote this. Anyway, so yeah, this is the one and done super dash girl that Jimmy Olsen wished into existence because of a totem that he had that gave him magic wishes. I know this story from the greatest Superman stories ever told trade paperback. It's a really cool one that it is just a bunch of really great weird Superman stories that just highlight just how creative and exciting his Superman doesn't really subscribe to the like golden age, silver age kind of breakdown. Like what we consider the Superman silver age is really more of like the like late 50s era, which is like just a little bit before the Silver Age for most things when you consider the first appearance of Barry Allen as the beginning of the Silver Age, into the like just the very beginning of the Silver Age, and like Superman's like that heyday of the character. It's really when Jerry Siegel was on the book for a stretch that we got this like real magic for the character, and that's not quite in line with when the rest of the Silver Age was happening. Anyway, that's not the point. Long story short, this is a cool story about a Supergirl, and check it out.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, I have danced around Girls of Steel in this Superman Analogue series for long enough, so let's hit the main show. Today I'm going to cover the real OG. Well, I mean, after Mary Marvel, of course. Supergirl. So Supergirl was a one-off that was a beta test for the general idea of a distaff counterpart for Superman. She was a creation of Jimmy Olsen's in a 3-part story in which he had a magic totem that granted wishes. Oh, I should probably note that in some reprints, the character has been recolored so that she does not look like subsequent Supergirls. However, her original appearance is pretty much spot on for what we think of when we think of Supergirl. The story followed her bungling Superman's heroic efforts, but she ends it by sacrificing her own life to save him from kryptonite. Dark! Noteworthy here is that she was presented as a romantic rival for Lois Lane, and a suitable mate for Superman. Importantly, more than any other rendition of the character, this is the model for the design of the character that would be used most in other media, with the blue bodysuit and red skirt. And while she was a one-off, her story is actually pretty hardcore, and is unique enough to be distinct. Plus, as the first iteration of Supergirl, she was the clear prototype for the concept within the Superman family. So while Supergirl was the first, she by no means was the most iconic version of the character. So next time I'll be talking about the classic model, Kara Zor-El. But until then, stay super, man.
All right, so here is where I called an audible, because the first time, or when I wrote these, I put them out in a different order, and I knew that this time I had to do Kara Zor-El second. I had to do it both basically chronological order, because otherwise it was going to get really confusing. Just because these characters can get really confusing. So I had to do something like that. It's not perfectly chronological order because Power Girl is in a weird spot, but you get what I mean. Anyway, so here is Kara Zor-El, the classic Supergirl.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, when I was first writing these, I had originally intended to build up to today's Superman analog, but when trying to describe the various Supergirls that have existed, it was difficult to do so without referencing the classic model. So let's talk about Kara Zor-El, cousin of Superman, the once and future Supergirl. You see, when most people talk about Supergirl, they usually mean this one. Kara Zor-El was from Krypton, but made it to Earth after her family initially survived for a time adrift in the domed Argo City in space. Eventually, the city failed, and she was forced to flee to Earth, the last survivor of her community. Superman was not sure how to prepare her for the world initially, and thus hid her away in an orphanage where she took the name Linda Lee. Eventually, she had an equivalent of her debutante ball when she was adopted by the Danvers family, and she would go on to make her own way, starring in her own adventures and adopting a variety of period-appropriate outfits. And one thing I always loved about the character was her relationship with the future, air quotes, descendant of Brainiac, Brainiac 5, hero and member of the Legion of Superheroes. Long live the Legion! As time-lost members of warring houses, this was a delightful while wholesome version of Romeo and Juliet for the pulpy sci-fi set. And even if complications arose, it was such a nice touch. We tend to look back on Silver Age books as flat and simple, but this was such a refutation to that point. But anyway, this is where it gets a little sad. When DC cleaned house in the 80s, Supergirl died saving her cousin during an attack on an evil force from another reality. It is a goddamn brutal fight, and the weight of the conflict is palpable. And while the Barry Allen Flash is often remembered as the big casualty of the crisis, Supergirl doesn't even get the dignity of people remembering her loss, as she is shortly after wiped from continuity. Still, we got an amazing send-off. Seeing Superman weep for her loss. Of all the big moments in Crisis on Infinite Earths, this is the one that moved me the most. Now, for a time, this was it for Kara Zor-El, but her presence in outside media going forward cemented her role as the Supergirl. It began with a Helen Slater-helmed Supergirl movie in the 80s, in the wake of the Christopher Reeve Superman movies. While not fondly remembered, it was remembered. And hey, we talked about that on Men of Steel. The animated DCU featured Kara In-Z, who was an adopted cousin instead of a biological one for Superman. But for all purposes, the character is just the adaptation of Kara Zor-El for the medium. There was a version in Smallville too. And finally, Kara Zor-El is the basis for the recently concluded Supergirl TV show. And no joke, I freaking love this series. If you like Superman-related material, and you haven't checked it out, you owe it to yourself to do so. At times, it was truly inspirational and such a breath of fresh air from what we had been getting up until that point from DC, and really was the launching pad for the excellent Superman and Lois. Sure enough, the various media adaptations led to Kara being reintroduced decades later in the main DCU. She was first teased in the Many Happy Returns arc, where she crossed over with the 90s interpretation of Supergirl, and then she was permanently integrated into the DCU in the hugely popular Batman-Superman series. Since then, she has been a major player and the Supergirl of all the books. And I have to admit, I was dubious at first because of the excellent send-off the character got in Crisis on Infinite Earths. But since then, I have grown to love her latest tales. Supergirl is, in a real way, the best of Superman, and Kara Zor-El is the apex of that idea. She is willing to sacrifice everything to do what's right, but never gives up hope. However, Kara Zor-El was not the Supergirl I grew up with. So next time, we will be delving into the complicated story of Matrix. But until then, stay super, man.
Next up is, of course, the Matrix entity Supergirl / Linda Danvers. And this is a character I love explaining who she is. We just recorded an episode of Men of Steel on a story, on the Legends of Dead Earth story from that Supergirl run. And so we did talk a bit about the Matrix entity Supergirl. She's just so dang weird, and I just love her to death for it. And yeah, so that's fun. So I wanted to knock that one out before I got into then the side characters. So then we talk about Power Girl and Galatea. And then after that, we close out with Cir-El. So yeah, moving on, we are doing Linda Danvers, then Power Girl.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and for today's Superman Analogue, I want to talk about a strange creature of 90s comics. And in retrospect, she is so complicated to explain that it's hard to believe that she had the longevity that she did. But she was my Girl of Steel when I was getting into comics. So today, let's talk about Matrix, aka Linda Danvers, aka Supergirl. So following the John Byrne reboot of the franchise in the 80s, Superman was canonically the last Kryptonian, so the extended family he had built up was wiped away. However, in his last story before departing the book, Byrne introduced his own take on Supergirl, Matrix. Matrix was a creation of the Pocket Universe. Hey, and I am bringing it back! Which had fallen under siege to that reality's version of Zod and his allies. Their Superboy had died in the Legion of Superheroes story, so the benign Lex Luthor created a super being from Lana Lang. And while she was wholly artificial, she believed herself at first to be a superpowered version of Lana Lang. She recruited Superman to help fight off the super criminals, and that was its own story, but afterwards, she joined Superman in our reality, finally accepting that she was, in fact, an artificial being and not the original Lana Lang. So the Matrix entity was an artificial amorphous creation that was possessed of several superpowers, including shapeshifting so that it could look like a person, as well as strength and flight and invisibility and psychic blasts, and all of this is sounding a lot closer, frankly, to Martian Manhunter. And while the Matrix entity had some pre-programmed memories from Lana Lang, it was very naive at first, and it spent a lot of time confused about its identity while being raised up by the Kents. When the Matrix entity decided to actually go back out into the world and permanently don the identity of Supergirl, she mistook the young clone of Lex Luthor, who was masquerading as his own son at the time, to be her creator reborn, and fell in love with him. She would go on to serve at his side, often manipulated to further his schemes. This led to her being held back in times where she could have assisted, such as the fight with Doomsday, though she later joined that fight only to find her invulnerability wanting. Fortunately, she was still just a goo person then and was able to reform herself, but it's clear that while Supergirl was impressive compared to most heroes in terms of powers, she didn't quite hold a candle to a true Kryptonian. Now, eventually, the clone Lex was revealed to have the mind of the OG Lex Luthor and to be, gasp, evil. So Supergirl, understandably, lost it. After being held back from murdering the person who had seduced her and manipulated her, she wandered about without purpose for a time. I mean, she joined the Titans, but she didn't have like a shtick besides being part of the super family at this point. And this is where we get to the Peter David run. He had the Matrix entity merge with a dying girl named Linda Danvers, which was one of the names that Kara Zor-El used as her secret identity back in the Silver Age. The fusion of these two beings stabilized them both, limiting the Matrix entity's powers, but linking it to the soul of a real person, albeit kind of a lost one. And so this fusion of artificial purity and real humanity created something special. It birthed an Earth-born angel. Supergirl became a being of holy fire, replete with blazing wings and eyes of flame. This was not to last, despite that being the original intent. The animated Supergirl had become very popular, so this Supergirl's design was altered to match that. The fused being was split in two, and we were left to follow Danvers now, who was left with a fraction of the power she had wielded when fully combined with Matrix, as she searched for her other half. And this is where the character really proved herself as a hero in my mind. She had the Golden Age Superman's powers while struggling with the power-creeped foes of the day. Eventually she got a power boost, but never fully merged with the Matrix side again, which had ascended as a full-on angel. The closing arc of that run was a story called Many Happy Returns, which is one of my favorites. In it, we see a version of Kara Zor-El show up, and eventually Linda takes her place in the Silver Age continuity, only to have to send her back in order to save the multiverse. However, while there, she fell in love with the Silver Age Superman, and I need to remind you that they are not related, and go on to start a family together. Side note, this version of Kara Zor-El that we saw briefly had a thing with the Kon-El version of Superboy. And I need to note that at this point, the character was a human clone modified to resemble Superman, not an actual clone of Superman. I mean, I guess they're all secretly horny for each other and just hold back because of taboos, but at this time, neither of those relationships were actually weird. Anyway, this Supergirl sacrifices herself to save all the multiverse, but more importantly, her daughter, who survives somewhere on the edge of reality. This Supergirl is just as noble as the original, going on a far more complicated journey, even if it's indicated that she too survived, but has hidden herself from the public eye. She was cool and she was weird. She was the Supergirl I grew up with, and damn, was she a doozy. However, next time we're gonna talk about a Supergirl who was also pretty complicated, so we'll be talking about Power Girl. But until next time, stay super, man. All right, so now it's time to talk about Power Girl, and this is where, okay, so since this came out, there was both the, I forget the name of it, but the Mark Russell like corporate like DC corporate book that featured Power Girl as the villain, and then more recently the Power Girl series that that renamed the character from Karen Starr to Paige something. A choice that I am not a fan of, for the record. I don't think it made sense. I think it was fine just having her have a name that she's had for this entire time. But it's not the end of the world. It's not enough to ruin the book for me. I've enjoyed it mostly. It's been hard for me to like stay on top of books recently because of having a toddler. But it is still like I like Power Girl as a character, and I'm happy that she is getting published and is part of the DC recognition of the Superman family. That's important because sometimes she's been ignored as part of the Superman family, and that's not cool because she's Supergirl from Earth 2. Like, come on, man. Anyway, here's the video. Hey everyone. I'm Case Aiken. Now, considering that I have already gotten to the Supergirl of the 90s and early 2000s, it's fair to say that the timeline is a bit jumbled, but that's appropriate for today's character, because for my Superman analog today, we're talking about Karen Starr, aka Kara Zor-El, aka Power Girl. So when she was introduced in the 70s, Power Girl was from Earth 2, the alternate reality where all the Golden Age superheroes were from. This was from the prime era of the original DC multiverse, and she was presented as her world's version of Supergirl. But given that this was the 70s, and the characters on her world had been operating since the 40s, Superman had had a 40-year career at this point. It was in this same era that we would get Infinity Inc., which was a group of teen children of all those 1940s superheroes. So now, I've heard this story is apocryphal, but it's become so famous that it is part of the lore of the character. And that's when discussing, shall we say, some of her more notable attributes. You see, the story goes that when Wally Wood originally designed the character, he kept increasing her bust size issue over issue, waiting for someone from editorial to say something. And it just never happened. And now that element has become a defining characteristic for the character. And again, I've been told that that is apocryphal, but it is a really funny story and people like to tell it, so I'm telling it here. And obviously her design did emphasize her boobs. Sorry, I just gotta say it. And sometimes it was with a boob window, and sometimes it was with a plunging neckline, but eventually it got really extreme. And to counterbalance this sort of sexualized portrayal of the character, Power Girl was given a much tougher, no-nonsense personality compared to her Earth 1 counterpart, Kara Zor-El. And this was somewhat justified because she lost a lot of her life when she traveled to Earth from Krypton. She emerged as an adult rather than as a youth, as the Earth 1 version had. This concoction of a tough attitude with classic Superman-type powers and visual aid, I guess we will call it, was a big reason for why the character survived the Crisis on Infinite Earths in the 80s. However, the rule about no other Kryptonians meant that her origin was retconned several times, including at one point making her Atlantean with magical powers. During this period where she was supposed to have an Atlantean origin, her weaknesses were changed from kryptonite to anything natural, such as wood. During this period, they also tried out other costumes, none of which stuck, and it's a good thing that she keeps reverting back to a more classic style. The Power Girl outfit is really good. The white bodysuit looks distinct from Supergirl, while at the same time still feeling like part of the same family, despite no other member of the super family having a white bodysuit. And that's complemented by the blue gloves and boots. And it's been further improved upon with various design flourishes, such as piping along the body and a repositioning of the cape to more resemble a royal cloak. It's a design that allows for a lot of permutations without really looking like a totally different design. And oh hey, I should probably note that there's always been this weird parallel between Power Girl and Ms. Marvel, specifically Carol Danvers. For one thing, Carol Danvers already has a name that reflects the Karen first name, but then Danvers is traditionally the last name of Supergirl in any of her forms. I mean, both characters have take-no-bullshit types of attitudes, and also both characters were involved in terrible stories involving magically induced pregnancies. And then she had a renaissance in the late 90s, early 2000s, which restored her classic look and eventually her classic origin as well. And now since then, she has often been paired with Supergirl as sort of a big sister type, and usually has been depicted as a friend of Huntress, which in the original Earth 2 timeline was the daughter of Batman with Catwoman. And this continues the Super Bat alliance across realities and timelines. She would be a part of the New 52 era, though with controversy around her costume. However, I'm just happy that this Take Charge lady is back on the front lines of DC Comics. She's complicated and weird, and that's what comics are for, right? Well, next time we're going to talk about an attempt to simplify Power Girl, but until then, stay super, man. All right, next up is Galatea, and that should be pretty obvious why. Galatea is the DC universe, or the DC animated universe equivalent to Power Girl that they did in Justice League Unlimited. So yeah, here is this. It's more of a one-off character, and obviously she's kind of villainous, but she's a clone of Supergirl. So here's the video. Hey everyone. I'm Case Aiken. In the DC animated universe, Supergirl had a clone that was not only a successful creation, something we will circle back to eventually, but also aged to peak maturity. So let's talk about an evil Superman analog, Galatea. Being a clone, her name is fitting, given that she is named after a character from Greek mythology that was a statue given life. The character was first teased when Supergirl dreams of doing destructive acts, which we later discover was training sessions that Galatea was going through. You see, she was an agent of the super science organization Cadmus, trained to be a killer, although she did treat Emil Hamilton, the scientist who created her, as her father, even calling him daddy. On top of that, she was jealous of Supergirl and believed her own life to be less valid while the original lived. Eventually, this all came to a head, with Galatea leading an army of cloned super beings under her control against the JLU. Supergirl prevailed and Galatea was killed. I think this put her total number of appearances at 3 episodes, maybe 4. Galatea served as this setting's version of Power Girl. Clearly her design is modeled after Power Girl's classic costume, although it is a little bit simpler with only white instead of having the red and blue accents, and I rather like that simple look here. Plus it ties back to the Greek meaning of her name, which is she who is milk white. It's very sleek and makes the character feel like an operator. She also represents an interesting variant on the Bizarro concept. Here, a more successful and powerful duplicate. But while she didn't have very many appearances, Galatea stood out as an interesting and complex villain. However, next time we are going to finish up our conversation about Supergirls by talking about the most maligned of the Supergirl characters, Cir-El. But until then, stay super, man.
And of course, we close out our conversation on Supergirls with Cir-El, probably the weirdest Supergirl, and I'm saying that fully thinking about the totem entity super/girl, and also just the Matrix entity Supergirl. Maybe not. Supergirls are weird, y'all. Like you would think that the basic setup of Superman's cousin should make it simple, but every other version has been so strange. Anyway, Cir-El is very strange, and here's a video explaining how.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, in this Superman Analogue series about Supergirls, I've talked about villainous clones and magical prototypes. I've talked about the classic model, the Bronze Age Dark Horse, and the 90s protoplasmic usurper. But right now, I want to finish up the series by talking about Cir-El. Cir-El originally appeared shortly after the fabulous Peter David run on the 90s early aughts series. So she had a mark against her in my book. She was originally presented as the daughter of Superman and Lois Lane from a future timeline, and that was at least different. But it was shortly thereafter revealed that she was actually a human modified with Kryptonian DNA by Brainiac. As a plot and yada yada yada, she died, saving Superman, weirdly paralleling the original Supergirl. And also the second Supergirl. So her run was brief. She followed a beloved dark horse of the franchise. She was quickly replaced by a more lasting iteration, but she also had a distinct look and story. She was interesting, but is often forgotten in the pantheon of Supergirls, but still worthy of discussion here. But that said, her name has been in conversation recently, but mostly for bad reasons. You see, in the debacle that is the current state of DC movies, we were supposed to get a Supergirl appearance played by Sasha Calle, and she looked great in the part. And even though we never got confirmation that this was supposed to be Cir-El, I mean, that's the one she looks like, so people tend to think that's the case. However, since the Discovery merger with Warner Brothers, a lot of projects have been canceled, and apparently the Supergirl movie is one of them. So unfortunately, we're probably not gonna see her on screen. And that's a shame. I watched the video when she was told she got the part, and it's super cute.
All right, do you wanna fly?
Yeah, I would love to.
Okay. Well, then maybe you will need this. You know what this is?
What?
You're Supergirl.
Can I freak out for a second?
Of course, yeah, take your time.
I got it.
Sabía lo que era.
So sadly, rather than having new life infused in her by way of outside media, the character will probably always be this weird meta footnote about the Superman mythos. And that's a shame, because while I was dubious of the character at first, I did grow to like her, and am sad that we never really got to know the character past her short tenure. But with that, we are done talking about Supergirls. But next time, let's pivot to talking about something a little bit more evil, as we talk about a character who is about to get way more popular as he is the villain of the upcoming Black Adam movie. And that is Sabbac. But until then, stay super, man.
So that closes out our Supergirl coverage. And this is where we pivot into talking about villains. And this was a little bit of a reshuffling for me, specifically so that I could have Black Adam come out roughly in time for the Black Adam movie coming out. Likewise, Sabak, I had to shuffle around to get out there. But, you know, it's wild because I already had a Sabak thread written like long before the movie was announced. So, yeah, so here's a video on Sabak, who I thought was going to be a little bit better known because of the Black Adam movie. And then the Black Adam movie didn't hit as hard as some of us were hoping it would.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken. Now, Captain Marvel, sometimes known as Shazam, had a lot of dark counterparts. And for today's Superman Analogue, I want to talk about Sabak, a character that I didn't know about at all, really, until his revival in Judd Winnick's Outsiders in the 2000s. Despite being a Golden Age character, it's no surprise that Sabak was buried in the Silver Age, what with the comic code and all. You see, rather than drawing his powers from gods, he drew his powers from devils and demons. It goes Satan for invincible strength, Im for indestructible body, Belial for evil wisdom, Beelzebub for flame powers, Asmodeus for evil courage, and Cratius for flight. And yes, I had to look that part up. He was more of a rival for Captain Marvel Jr. and matched him power for power. In the 2000s, a second version of the character was introduced, and that's the one who I first discovered. This was a Russian mobster, if I recall, who stole the powers of the original in order to compete in the landscape of super beings. I'm not entirely sure how much he's popped up since, but he is a good alternative to Black Adam, and actually is now going to be showing up in the Black Adam movie, presumably as the main villain. However, after being reintroduced to the then modern landscape of comics, his appearance in Outsiders was then quickly followed up with a mini-series reintroducing the original to the DCU in Superman Shazam First Thunder. Anyway, he gets my attention through being part of the Shazam franchise, plus it's a cool shtick. I love the flaming symbol on his chest, as I've always preferred when the lightning for Captain Marvel is represented as actually going all the way to the skin. And while Sabak can sometimes be drawn too generically as just a demon, I just love the concept. I'd love to see more of Sabak, and I'm sure with his upcoming appearance in the Black Adam movie, we will be seeing more of him in the comics as well. However, next time, let's talk about the most infamous of Captain Marvel rivals, someone who's getting his own movie, Black Adam. But until then, stay super, man.
All right, and that is our conversation about Sabak, who I would have loved to use footage from the movie because like he looked pretty good in the movie, for doing a take on Sabak. Moving on to Black Adam, man, this was of course before the movie came out because it was doing it in preparation for the movie. And then I overall like the movie. I think it's fine. I think you can see where the creative controls got in the way of making it the best movie it could be. And there's too many needle drops. Like, man, we've heard power way too many times. It wasn't a novel choice at this point. But it's still fine. Like it's not the end of the world as far as movies go. There's like good elements. There's good design choices for characters. The Rock is like, still an affable character actor. But it's fine. But anyway, here's the video on Black Adam. A character that is very well known about at this point and possibly better known than the heroic counterpart that he's a villain to.
Hey everyone, I'm Case Aiken, and this week we are getting a new entry in the DCEU that deals with a character who is more powerful than a locomotive and able to leap tall buildings with a single bound, although in this case it's because he's empowered by gods, because this week is the release of the Black Adam movie, and you know what? It makes sense to do some coverage on the character here. So for today's Superman Analogue, we are talking about that guy, Black Adam. Now, Black Adam makes for a pretty good Superman analog given his vast powers. When Black Adam was first introduced in the comics, he was presented as a previous champion of the wizard Shazam, just like Captain Marvel, but in his case in ancient Egypt. He was originally called Mighty Adam, before turning to evil and being rebranded as Black Adam. Like Captain Marvel or Shazam, depending on your preference, he draws his powers from a sextet of deities that he invokes by saying aloud the acronym Shazam. In his case, being from ancient Egypt, they're different deities than what we're used to. It's the stamina of Shu, the speed of Haru, the strength of Aman, the wisdom of Zahuti, the power of Etan, and the courage of Mehen. Though this has changed since originally it was the stamina of Shu, the strength of Hershef, the power of Aman, the wisdom of Zahuti, the speed of Anpu, and the courage of Mintu. Practically speaking, he's super strong, able to fly, nigh invulnerable, super fast, and magically cunning, along with pretty good senses, and in more recent versions has had lightning powers. It's a pretty complete package. In his first appearance, he was originally presented as a fallen champion of the past who was banished to the outer edge of the galaxy. He spent 5,000 years traveling back and fought the whole Marvel family. And you know what? He was a match for any of them, so no one was able to get an upper hand. Finally, Uncle Dudley, a character who I'm probably going to have to talk about at some point because he's one of the stranger sidekicks, tricked him into saying the name of the wizard, reverting him back to his human form, who, being over 5,000 years old, then aged rapidly and died. And that was it. As far as I know, he did not appear again until the Bronze Age revival by DC. With his power, he became a recurring villain when they needed a real threat for the various Superman-class characters of the multiverse. Then, in the 90s reboot, he became a reincarnation of the ancient champion Teth Adam. This created an interesting contrast as his modern persona was much more thuggish and battled for control with the ancient version, who was recast as more of a brutal but honorable anti-hero. That modern persona, Theo Adam, was actually responsible for the murder of Billy Batson's parents, ultimately setting Billy on the pathway to become Captain Marvel. From there, Black Adam would go on to show up in various media as a villain, and every version of Captain Marvel / Shazam now included an appearance by the mighty antagonist. But then a funny thing happened. That anti-hero persona for Black Adam became really popular. He was retconned to hail from Kahndaq, which was presented as a vassal state of ancient Egypt, and his motives were changed to reflect an older sense of justice. He became somewhat reformed and joined the Justice Society. So yes, he was an SJW. He had a popular story in 52, one of my favorites, and when DC relaunched the line with the new 52, he quickly was established as a threat to the DC heroes, and honestly a bigger player than the newly renamed Shazam himself. And his popularity continues to rise. He's been in Batman cartoons and various video games. There's just something compelling about an evil Superman who can be reasoned with. He's strong, smart, and dangerous, but he's got a sense of honor. He's in many ways become the DC version of Namor. Hell, he's been part of the Justice League in their most recent run, and has gotten quite the glow-up considering that he used to be depicted as a middle-aged man with trollish features, and now is pretty conventionally handsome. Oh, and like I said at the top, there's a movie coming out. Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson was a producer on Shazam and has been linked to the character for a real long time. Honestly, I've been fan casting him since I was in high school. And now we're finally getting that movie, which I'm very excited for. Based on everything we've seen, I feel like we're getting a morally gray version of the character as opposed to an outright villain, and I think that's great. In my opinion, you can't have too many characters empowered by gods flying around. But hey, next time we're gonna continue talking about a dark reflection of Captain Marvel, in this case, quite literally, when we talk about Niatpac Levram. But until then, stay super, man.
So yeah, we close out our conversation from Black Adam and talking about villains in general, moving on to a literal reverse of Captain Marvel in the form of Niatpac Levram. And I think that this is really appropriate that we end this whole series of videos with Niatpac Levram, because the first video in this whole series, the video one in the Superman Analogue series was Captain Marvel, was Shazam. And so if you look at the first 100 episodes, it is a perfect bookend where we started with Captain Marvel and we end with Niatpac Levram, the mirror image of Captain Marvel. So here's that video.
Oh, wait, no, we're not doing this. I'm sorry, this is too much. Let's try that again. Hey everyone, I'm K. Sagan. Now, this weekend marks the release of Black Adam, which I saw on Thursday, and I overall pretty much enjoyed it. and it's put me in the mood to continue talking about characters related to the Shazam property. So let's talk about a very literal dark reflection of the classic Captain Marvel, Niatpac Levram, the mirror version of the character. So in a story from 1952, a wizard created Niatpac Levram from the reflection of Captain Marvel, literally creating a construct out of the mirror. He seemed to be a pawn of the wizard, so the character wasn't a perfect foil despite matching him power for power, and thus a perfect Superman analog for discussion. Captain Marvel ultimately won the day by forcing him back into the mirror. Design-wise, this version just had his lightning bolt reversed, as he was just a reflection of the character. He also spoke in reverse. However, when the character was revisited in the 70s, his colors were inverted, reverse flash style, which was continued in later appearances. I mean, it's a classic idea. Hell, I always had a pitch for Captain Marvel that included a similar concept before discovering it had already been done. And it's good fare for comic books because it reads without broader implications due to the character's constructed nature. Now, as with many aspects of the Golden Age Captain Marvel Shazam franchise, this is a prototype for later ideas that would be used in other series, such as an artificially created imperfect duplicate. It's a great way to have a physical threat that doesn't have too much of a distinct advantage. And this idea would be revisited with future characters. So next time we're going to talk about the reflection of a different Superman analog when we talk about Emmerpuss, the reverse version of Supreme. But until then, stay super, man.
And that, of course, is Niatpac Levram. It's always a good time doing a character in the Shazam family, and this is one that has, at the very least, like a couple of really distinct appearances that I wanted to talk about. So, you know, as with the previous one, the next video does have a like thematic through line coming from this one. It's another villain, quote unquote, and it's also a weird one, but it's its own thing. So yeah, and that, I mean, it's Emmerpuss from Supreme. It's not a secret. I don't need to tease it like it's some sort of big thing. The video itself referred to it. But anyway, thank you for listening to this video. If you watched this whole thing and actually like paid attention to these interstitials, I really appreciate you being a part of this. The Superman Analog series has been a thing that I really care about, and I am very appreciative of everyone for watching and making this a thing that has really helped this YouTube channel grow and be something special. It's been a labor of love for me over the last, almost 10 years now. But especially the last 5 years of me really working on the YouTube channel, not just the podcast. And so, yeah, thank you for being here and for checking out this celebration of the Superman Analog series. We have done 150 episodes now, and this is a special episode release that I just wanted to get out there and you know, give people an opportunity to binge watch these without me saying thank you in between every single video. So here you go, guys. Thanks. And have a great week.